The idea of Saint Benedict. Excerpts from Benedictine Monasticism, Studies in Benedictine Life and the Rule, written by Abbot Cuthbert Butler, 1919. Saint Benedict's idea. How far have Benedictine history and work in the world, and it may be said, Benedictine ideas gone beyond anything that could have been in Saint Benedict's mind? How little he thought that his monks were to be apostles, missionaries, civilizers, schoolmasters, editors of the Fathers. How surprised would he have been at the figure of a medieval mitred abbot, a feudal baron, fulfilling the functions of a great landlord and of a statesman. How bewildering to him would have been the gorgeous church functions and the stately ceremonial that have become one of the most cherished traditions among his sons. How meaningless would the work that has come to be regarded as characteristically Benedictine have seemed in his eyes, and how strange would the adjective learned, associated as a sort of constans epheton, with his name have sounded in his ears, who, to use St. Gregory's quaint phrase, fled from the Roman schools, sciniter nescius et sapienter indoctus. What a development, what a transformation is here! Yet, for all that, it is by the common consent recognized that, on the whole, and in its great currents, Benedictine history has been true to the idea of the founder, a legitimate development, not a perversion. In this passage is applied to Benedictine monasticism the principle accepted in regard to all institutions, social, political, religious, that live on and work during long periods of time, that they need change and develop and grow, and may be almost out of recognition. It is a sign of life, for to live is to grow and to change, and such changes, however seemingly great, which are but as the vital responses of a living organism to the conditions and needs of its successive environments, are justified as legitimate and true developments of the original idea. Hence to isolate St. Benedict's ideas, or St. Francis's ideas, and make it the sole measure of Benedictine or Franciscan history, ruling out whatever was not explicitly present to the founder's consciousness, would be unhistorical, uncritical, and untrue. And so, if we now endeavor to bring out into the clear St. Benedict's own idea, his reconstruction of monasticism as it shaped itself in his mind, it is not at all with the object of showing that whatever is outside his concept is thereby false to his idea, or that the most literal reproduction of the physical conditions of life in his monastery would be the most faithful presentation of his mind and spirit throughout all ages. Quite otherwise. But, on the other hand, it is true that fidelity to the original type and continuity of principles are the chief tests of the truth of historical developments. And so an examination and appreciation of St. Benedict's idea in its simplicity, and as it was in his own mind, is the necessary prelude to any study of Benedictine monasticism. The norm by which must be judged all manifestations of Benedictine life and activities at all times. We have, therefore, at the outset, to try to arrive at a correct conception of what St. Benedict's idea was. It is fortunate that he tells us himself quite definitively what he intends to do. We are going to establish a school of God's service, in which we hope we shall establish nothing harsh, nothing burdensome. Taken from the prologue of St. Benedict's Rule. St. Benedict, we have seen, when he first made up his mind to be a monk, acting according to the Egyptian monastic ideals current in Western Europe, retired to a desert spot and dwelt in a cave, enduring hunger and thirst, heat and cold, and all the severity of the weather. But when he came to write his rule and to legislate for the life of his own monastery of Monte Cassino, and others that might adopt his rule, his ideas had undergone a change, embodied in those words in which he says that in the school of divine service he was founding, he intended to establish nothing harsh or burdensome. These words have very commonly been interpreted as a pious exaggeration or device to encourage his disciples, and as not really meaning what they say. But it is easy to show that they do mean exactly what they say. They are borne out of by the other passages of the rule. The 49th chapter opens, "Though we read that a monk's life should at all times have the Lenten observance, yet, as few have this courage, we urge them in these days of Lent to wash away the negligences of other times." Similarly, in the 40th chapter, "Though we read that wine is not for monks at all, yet, as in our days monks cannot be persuaded of this, at any rate let us agree to use it sparingly." And there are other cases in which what may be called the appeal to a monastic tradition in regard to austerity of life is made, only to be set aside, that mitigations may be deliberately adopted. This point will be worked out in some detail in the next chapter. Here it will suffice to quote St. Benedict's works when summing up in the last chapter of the rule. "We have written this rule in order that by observing it in monasteries we may show we have in some measure, at any rate, integrity of morals and a beginning of the monastic life." And in concluding, he calls his rule a very little rule for beginners. In this, St. Benedict is not using the language of a feigned humility, but is speaking the very truth, as appears from a comparison of his rule with the records of the monasticism of Egypt or of Western Europe in his day. However austere may seem in the 20th century a life according to the letter of St. Benedict's rule, in his own day it can have appeared but as an easy form of monastic life, when compared either with the existing monastic rules and accepted traditions on the one hand, or with the ordinary discipline of the Church for the faithful, as in the matter of fasting and penitential code on the other. Indeed, Dom Morin describes that in these matters St. Benedict's regimen was no more than was often imposed on Christian living in the world. Thus, in his reconstruction of the monastic life of St. Benedict's idea was to establish a manner of life, self-denying of course and hard, but not a life of great austerity. Benedictine life is not, and is not intended to be, what is called a penitential life. And anyone who feels called to such a life should go to some other order and not become a Benedictine, for a life such as this is not in accordance with St. Benedict's idea. Another of St. Benedict's fundamental ideas appears in the first chapter of the rule. He lays it down that he writes his rule for cenobites, i.e., monks living in community, and for cenobites only. After speaking of other kinds of monks, both good and bad, he says in conclusion, "Let us proceed to legislate for the strongest and best kind, the cenobites." He has just given a definition of cenobites, but as this chapter is in large measure based on the passages of St. Jerome and Cassian, it will be helpful to know precisely their idea of cenobites, which St. Benedict had before his eyes when framing his own definition. St. Jerome only says that cenobites may be called men living in common, or dwelling in common. Cassian's description is, who live together in a congregation and are governed by the judgment of a single elder. St. Benedict explains cenobites as monasterial, serving as Christ's soldiers under a rule or abbot. He uses the word monasterial, not monastic, as the latter would be applicable to hermits as well as cenobites. Monasterial receives its interpretation in various places in the rule, dwelling in cenoba, preserving in the monastery till death, and as a matter of fact, the whole tenor of the rule contemplates nothing else than an organized community living a fully common life under the rule, common prayer, common work, common meals, common dormitory, a life lived wholly with the precincts of the monastery, the occasions of going forth being reduced to a minimum and regarded as definitely undesirable and dangerous. St. Benedict speaks indeed with admiration of the eremitical life, which then formed an integral part of European monasticism, and was commonly regarded not only as the most perfect realization of the monastic life, but as the goal to be aimed at in practice by those who had the necessary courage and strength and virtue. But he expressly declares that he legislates for cenobites alone. Consequently, when we find instances of Eastern or Western monks, especially Irish, going forth from their monasteries to lead the eremitical life, or when we see them undertaking pilgrimages or wanderings as a practice of asceticism, as is common now amongst Buddhist ascetics, such things have great interest for the general history of monasticism, but they have no interest for Benedictine history, and afford no help for the interpretation of St. Benedict's idea, which was plainly and only cenobitic. There are other kinds of monks, good and bad, but St. Benedict's idea of his own monks was that they were to be cenobites, spending their lives in the monastery under the conditions of community life. But St. Benedict introduced a modification into the idea of cenobitical life. Up to his time, monks, though looked upon as bound, whether by vows or without them, irrevocably to the practice of the monastic life, so that to abandon it was considered an apostasy, still were not tied to a particular monastery or community, but were allowed with little difficulty to pass from one house to another. St. Benedict's most special and tangible contribution to the development of monasticism was the introduction of the vow of stability. It will be necessary later on to inquire with some care what was his own full idea of stability. Here it will be enough to say, in general, that by it he put a stop to such liberty of passage from monastery to monastery, and incorporated the monk by his profession in the community of his own monastery. St. Benedict thus bound the monks of a monastery together into a permanent family, united by bonds that lasted for life. This idea that the monks of each Benedictine monastery form a permanent community, distinct from that of every other Benedictine monastery, is among the most characteristic features of Benedictine monasticism, a chief discriminant between it and the later orders. This idea of the monastic family, at any rate in its concrete realization, was St. Benedict's. The great Coptic monasteries of Pacomus and Shunit were far too big to be families. They were rather great agricultural colonies divided into houses and organized on the basis of the different trades carried on in them. Concerning the inner life of St. Basil's monasteries, we have not sufficient information, but neither St. Martin of Tours, where the 80 monks abode in separate caves, nor the huge Celtic monasteries with their hundreds of monks can be regarded as embodying the family type so characteristic of Benedictine monasticism, nor could they, without the idea enshrined in the Benedictine vow of stability. In view of current notions concerning religious orders, it is necessary here at the outset to bring out a negative side of St. Benedict's idea, and emphasize the fact that he had no thought of instituting an order. There was no such thing in his time as monastic or other orders. St. Benedict had no intention that the monastery wherein his rule was followed should form a group apart, nor did they for many centuries, but each Benedictine monastery was a separate entity, autonomous and self-contained, having no organic bonds with other monasteries. Among the houses of the black monks, pure and simple, that is, outside the systems of Cluny and Citeaux, each abbey continued to stand in its primitive isolation until the formation of national chapters at the beginning of the 13th century. Moreover, associated with the modern concept of a religious order is the idea of some special work to be done, some need of the church to be met, and a man joins the order hoping thereby to be enabled to better to carry out this work which he feels called. But with the Benedictines it was not so. There was no special form of work which their organization was designed to undertake. A man became a monk precisely because he felt to be a monk, and for no other purpose or object whatever, nor as a preparation for anything else, except heaven. The monk's object is to sanctify his soul and serve God by leading a life in community in accordance with the gospel counsels. Work of various kinds will be given unto him to do, but these are secondary, and no one of them is part of his essential vocation as a monk. What has been said may be illustrated and enforced from the earlier pages of Cardinal Gasquet's Sketch of a Monastic History. The monastic life is nothing more than the Christian life of the gospel counsels conceived in its full simplicity and perfection. It has no determinate object in view beyond this. It has no special system or methods. The broad law of Christian liberty is its only guide. It is neither strict nor lax. It aims neither at too high things, nor is it content with any low standard of conduct. But it adapts itself to the workings of grace, and in each individual soul gains its end when it has brought the individual soul to the highest perfection of which its natural and supernatural gifts render it capable. Again, it is merely a systemized form of life according to the gospel's counsels, existing for its own sake as a full expression of the Church's true and perfect life. Returning to St. Benedict's definition of his monastery as a school of the service of God, we ask, what was the kind of service that he established? It may be said to be contained in the three services: self-discipline, prayer, work. Of these three services, self-discipline is, of course, the subjective basis and condition of the others, that which gives its meaning to the whole life. It will be enlarged upon in 2 succeeding chapters. Of the external services, St. Benedict placed prayer, in particular common prayer, the celebration in choir of the canonical office, first in order of thought and importance. He calls it the duty, or the task of our service. It has so filled his mind that it is the one subject on which he legislates in minute detail, devoting 11 chapters to that ordering of the psalmody and office which after 14 centuries is still used by his sons. The work of God is his name for it, and he says that nothing is to be set before the work of God, that by work of God, St. Benedict means precisely the public recital of the office, and nothing else is made clear by an examination of the places where the terms occurs in the rule. The prominence of the Opus Dei, work of God, in St. Benedict's mind has been erected into a principle that the public celebration of the office is the purpose of his institute, and that Benedictines exist for the sake of the choir, propter coram fundasti. I have heard a Benedictine abbot who expressed this idea so crudely as to say to his monks, "You have the choir and the refectory. What more do you need?" But the view finds expression also in Abbot Dolette's excellent commentary on the rule, which I read in general with great agreement. Quote, "The proper and distinctive work of the Benedictine, his portion, his mission, is the liturgy. He makes his profession in order to be one in the Church, the society of divine praise, who glorifies God according to the forms instituted by herself." End quote. This means that the essence of a Benedictine vocation is the celebration of the liturgy. If that be the case, it is due to St. Benedict himself, and must be counted among the innovations he made in the monastic life, for it was not part of the inheritance he received from the earlier monasticism. The public celebration of the canonical office always held a prominent place in cenobitical life of whatever kind, but the idea that it was the essence of the life does not emerge from the records of the Egyptian monks, nor from the writings of St. Basil or Cassian. So far as the earlier monasticism goes, a much stronger case could be made out for Father Augustine Baker's contention that private spiritual prayer is the scope of the monastic state. The Nihil opera Dei paraponator, when taken in its context and its relations to the passage in the rule of Macarius on which it is based, does not afford ground for thinking St. Benedict narrowed the conception of the monastic life in this way. It is to be supposed that his idea was, "I want to secure the celebration of the divine office, and therefore I will establish a monastery." This is no doubt has been true of many a founder of individual monasteries, collegiate chapters, and charities in the Middle Ages, but can hardly be true of St. Benedict. Was not his idea rather, "I want to establish a monastery to be a school of God's service, wherein the primary community service shall be the public celebration of the divine office"? Consequently, I agree with Dom Morin in holding that the propter coram fundasti is an exaggeration. I believe the idea arose at a later date in the 9th or 10th century, at a time when manual labor had dropped out of the life of the monasteries, and there was a prodigious increase in the church services, masses, offices, additional devotions, so that the monks spent most of their time in church, as will be explained in a later chapter. It was then, too, that the liturgical pomp and circumstance and elaboration of ritual underwent a great development, whereas St. Benedict's liturgy was doubtless of a severe simplicity that would nowadays appear Puritan. But whatever view be held on this point of Benedictine theory, all will accept that Cardinal Gasquet has written on the actual place the office holds in Benedictine life. The central figure of the society of the monastery was its divine king. The monastery was a palace, a court, and the divine office was the daily service and formal homage rendered to the divine majesty. This, the Opus Dei, was the crown of the whole structure of the monastic edifice. It was preeminently the work of the monk which was to take precedence over every other employment, and to which monastic tradition has ever given a marked solemnity. Day by day, and almost hour by hour, the monk, purified by his vows, enclosed from the world, seeks to renew the wonderful familiarity with his God and Father, which our first parents forfeited, but which, through our second Adam, is restored in the Christian Church. In a word, the divine office is the soul of the monastic life. The declarations of the English congregation say that our primary duty is to carry out on earth what the angels do in heaven, and this is probably no exception will be taken. Of the service of work, it will here suffice to say that the work fell under the categories of manual labor and reading, between which were apportioned the hours of the day not spent in the church. The labor was predominantly work in the fields and garden, or the household and kitchen, and elsewhere, necessary for the life of a large community. The reading, it may be safely said, was confined to the Scriptures and the Fathers, and was devotional rather than intellectual in character and scope. Lectio Divinae is St. Benedict's way of describing it. A simple life it was, made up of a round of simple duties, and the monks were quite simple men, though no doubt some were of the same station in life as St. Benedict himself. The great majority of them were recruited from the Italian peasantry, or from some semi-barbarous Gothic invaders. They were not priests, they were not clerics. There were only 2 or 3 priests, perhaps only 1 in the community, just sufficient to celebrate the Sunday Mass and administer the sacraments. The general conditions of life were probably not rougher or harder than would have been the lot of most of them had they remained in the world. The difference lay in the element of religion brought into every detail of their lives, and so they lived together their common life, serving God by the daily round of duties in the choir, in farm and garden, in kitchen and bakehouse and worship, chanting, praying, working, reading, meditating, their life work and their life interests being concentrated as far as possible within the precincts of the monastery or its immediate vicinity. Such were the primitive Benedictines, St. Benedict's own monks. Such was the mustard seed which has grown into the great and varied and complex tree that will be revealed to us when we come to study St. Benedict's Institute as it has developed itself in history. Such was St. Benedict's own idea of the monasticism which in the maturity of his religious experience and spiritual wisdom he established at Monte Cassino and legislated for in his rule. And this was the community, and these the men, destined by God to play so great a part in repairing the ruin, religious, social, material, in which Europe was lying, and in converting, Christianizing, and educating the new nations that were to make the new great Christian commonwealth. From what has been said, the pertinent observation follows, that to set up, as has been done, St. Benedict in his cave at Subiaco, as the embodiment of the truest Benedictine ideal, and the pattern which it would be well for Benedictines, had they the courage and firmness of mind to try to imitate it, is unhistorical and untrue. No less untrue it would be to set up St. Ignatius at Manresa, and the best embodiment of the spirit and life of the society he founded. Such episodes in the lives of these and other great founders were only periods of formation and preparation for their work of religious creation, and when they came forth from their retirement, they did not shape their institutes on the lines they had themselves at first adopted, but in conformity with the lessons they had learned therein in many things they turned their back upon their early experiences, so that they were fully formed and matured idea is to be seen in their rules and in their institutes, in the final form in which they left them. It is impossible to include under any single formula St. Benedict's idea, or the essence of Benedictinism, just as impossible as it is to include under any single formula the essence of Christianity. All that can be done is to state various aspects which taken together may afford an adequate conception. The following description gathers up the points that have been brought out in this chapter. St. Benedict's idea was to form a community of monks bound to live together until death, under rule, in common life, in the monastery of their profession, as a religious family, leading a life not of marked austerity, but devoted to the service of God. The holy service they have professed, he calls it. the service consisting in the community act of the celebration of the divine office and in the discipline of a life ordered on daily manual work and religious reading, according to the rule and under obedience to the abbot. It will be of interest in the conclusion to confront this account of original Benedictine life with Newman's impressions of it given in his essay, The Mission of St. Benedict. Benedictines have reason to be grateful that one of Newman's knowledge and insight and historical genius should have given them this objective study of their life and spirit. The monks of those days, he writes, had a unity of object, of state and occupation. Their object was rest and peace. Their state was retirement. Their occupation was some work that was simple, as opposed to intellectual, prayer, fasting, meditation, study, transcription, manual labor, and other unexciting, soothing employments. The monastic institute, says the biographer of St. Maurus, demands summa quis, the most perfect quietness. And where was quietness to be found, if not in reverting to the original condition of man, as far as the changed circumstances of our race admitted, and having no wants, of which the supply was not close at hand, in the nil ad mare, and having neither hope nor fear of anything below, and daily prayer, daily bread, and daily work, one day being just like another, except that it was one step nearer than the day before, to that great day which would swallow up all days, the day of everlasting rest. Benedictine asceticism. 5 chapters will now be devoted to the inner life, or the personal dealings of the individual soul with God, and will study St. Benedict's mind, as it may be read in the Rule and in the Benedictine tradition, or the range of subjects embraced under the ideas of self-discipline and prayer. Self-discipline has already been put in the first place as the most fundamental among the services of that school of God's service that St. Benedict declared his monasticism to be, and it will be taken in this and the following chapter under the titles of asceticism and spiritual life. Rightly understood, these are indeed but different names for the same thing. Still, it will be convenient to treat them separately, and first, Benedictine asceticism. Elsewhere I have said, monasticism is a system of living which owes its origins to those tendencies of the human soul which are summed up in the terms asceticism and mysticism. Mysticism may broadly be described as the effort to give effect to the craving for a union of the soul with the deity already in his life, and asceticism as the effort to give effect to that hankering after an ever-progressive purification of the soul and an atoning for sin by renunciation and self-denial in things lawful. These two tendencies may well be said to be general instincts of humanity, because, though not always called into activity, they are always liable to be evoked, and in all ages and among all races they frequently have asserted themselves. Indeed, the history of religion shows that they are among the most deep-rooted and widespread instincts of the human soul, and monasticism is the attempt to develop and regulate their exercise. It is necessary briefly to set forth the real nature of asceticism and its place in Christian life, because without a proper notion of the theory of asceticism, it would not be possible to understand Benedictine monasticism, or any monasticism whatsoever. Asceticism denotes strictly ethical training, self-discipline in the widest sense of the term. So understood, asceticism must be an ingredient in every seriously lived Christian life, and as in any well-ordered moral life. But the name is hardly used of the ordinary endeavors of a good life. It connotes some special kind of endeavor, some sort of effort at self-denial and spiritual achievement beyond what is required in order to work out our salvation. It is a subject on which much has been written of late, and thoughtful non-Catholic opinion has traveled far from the crude old Protestant view that asceticism is unchristian and unnatural. To mention only English works, the subject is well dealt with in the chapters 1 and 3 of Henne's Spirit and Origin of Christian Monasticism, and more briefly in the first chapter of Lowther Clark's St. Basil, and 100 columns are devoted to it in Hastings' Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, where it is to be treated in full in a dozen sections by as many writers. It will be helpful to give various definitions or descriptions of asceticism from these writers, especially as they regard it from more or less critical standpoints. In the section Christian Asceticism of Hastings' Encyclopedia by well-known Protestant scholar Dr. Otto Zuckler, author of an exhaustive monograph Ascese and Monctum, and following account is given. The word, when used in the sphere of religion and ethics, denotes self-preparation for a virtuous course of conduct, the zealous practice of acts of devotion and morality. This practice of virtue, in the narrower and stricter sense, or what may be called moral gymnastic, may consist in exercises of an inward kind, prayer offered in the heart, examination of conscience and the like, or in acts of self-discipline, passing over into the outward life, self-mortifications by fastings, voluntary poverty, sexual continence, etc. Mr. Lothar Clark writes, asceticism is severe self-discipline undertaken for religious ends, and exercise with reference both to the natural desires of the body and distractions of the outer world. Mortification is a term closely akin to asceticism, and perhaps rather signifies the acts whereby the idea of asceticism is carried out in practice. The word goes back to St. Paul. The idea in ascetical language is the killing of the self in all of its evil manifestations: self-love, self-conceit, self-will, self-seeking, and every form of selfishness. Like asceticism, it is eternal or external, the external or bodily mortification being of value only insofar as it promotes the internal or spiritual. The well-known English Benedictine ascetic and mystic author, Father Augustine Baker, who will many times be referred to in the sequel, divides the whole range of the spiritual life into the two branches, mortification and prayer, these being only more concrete names for the abstract terms asceticism and mysticism as used above. Father Baker's treatment of mortification is in large measure a treatise on the chief religious virtues, including chapters on patience, humility, and the love of God. The latter would not in ordinary language be considered a mortification, but Father Baker's meaning is that love of God is the mortification of self-love. His conception of mortification is that by it we exercise all duties and practice all virtues with regard to ourselves. Thus, in general, mortification includes the exercise of all virtues. For in every act of virtue we mortify some inordinate passion and inclination of nature, so that to attain to perfect mortification is to be possessed of all virtues. Further, he says that prayer is in itself the most excellent and effectual mortification, for in it and by it the most secret risings of inordinate passions are contradicted. Such teaching carries the idea of interior or spiritual mortification to its extreme limit. It is under the leading idea of renunciation that Mr. Hannay considers asceticism, and also Mr. Workman, for whom monasticism is but a chapter in the long story of renunciation in the Christian Church, and in this they have Cassian with them, whose favorite name for monks is renunciant. Hannay writes, asceticism is the refusal to make any compromise with the ways of the world, even which ways which are without taint of actual sins, and such asceticisms as poverty, living in community, virginity, and fasting are each of them a great renunciation of the world and its ways. And so the three great renunciations consecrated in the three vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity have at all times been looked on as classic asceticisms. The idea of renunciation of the world was the most general conception of the monastic life, withdrawal being the earliest technical term for becoming a monk, a renouncing of the businesses and ambitions and pleasures of life, even the lawful ones. It implied solitude and silence, either absolute as with hermits or mitigated as with cenobites, and it involved in varying degrees a number of lesser renunciations, as of intoxicants or creature comforts or intellectual pursuits, largely at the choice of the individual. The foregoing writers, even so uncompromisingly a Protestant as Dr. Zuckler, recognize that renunciation and asceticism so understood are found in the New Testament. They have a place in our Lord's life, a life of virginity, with one recorded severe fast and poverty, at all times real and sometimes extreme, which those who accept the Christian tradition must believe to have been voluntarily chosen. The Sermon on the Mount is highly aesthetical, and so are many phrases of St. Paul's teaching. Asceticism soon found expression in the early church, and was recognized and well-established feature in Christian life before the monastic movement of the 4th century. All this is in accord with the trend of recent thought. But for all that, Canon Hannay is probably right in saying that a bedrock difference between Protestantism and Catholicism still lies precisely in this matter of asceticism and in the outlook on life. For Protestantism, the ideal of the highest Christian life is a well-ordered and religious use of the good things of life. It has little or no sympathy with renunciations or even purely spiritual asceticism, except in so far as they are necessary to secure this object. And for most of Father Baker's interior mortifications, it would have scant approval. Protestantism denies the theories of counsels of perfections as distinguished from precepts of the Christian code, and on the validity of this distinction, as Canon Hannay says, the theoretical justification of monasticism rests. As the matter cannot be discussed in this place, I am content to refer to his striking appendix of Counsels and Precepts, wherein he deals with it in view of the most modern Protestant position, that of Roth, which leads, he declares, to conclusions against the heart and conscience alike cry out. This must suffice on the general question of asceticism. From what has been said, it appears that asceticism falls under the 3 branches. 1. There is purely internal self-discipline in spiritual exercising, carried out in mind and heart and soul, without becoming in any way external. 2. There are the 3 great renunciations, especially those of the 3 evangelical councils, poverty, obedience, chastity, which have at all times been recognized as the principal external asceticisms. 3. There are the various forms of corporal austerities or bodily mortifications. The first will be dealt with in the next chapter on the spiritual life. In regard to the second, it is enough to say that the renunciations of the 3 councils, which are of the essence of the monastic state in all its forms, were adopted by St. Benedict without compromise. Obedience is the explicit object of one of the Benedictine vows, and if poverty and chastity are not, personal poverty and renunciation of private ownership is explicitly exacted, and in very complete fashion, by the rule. As for chastity, it is taken for granted as a condition of the life. To love chastity is one of St. Benedict's instruments of good works, and it cannot be doubted that the expressions, "the monk has no power over his own body," is used in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 4, and means that one professed monk, the monk is bound to the observance of chastity. It is the 3rd branch of asceticism, that of corporal austerity, that is to be dealt with here, and it is taken first because there is a common tendency to identify asceticism wrongly with this one form, and understand by the term self-inflicted, or at least deliberately chosen and sought, bodily austerities and discomforts. In deference to this current acceptation of the word, it is well to begin the study of Benedictine asceticism by examining St. Benedict's mind in regard to this kind of mortifications. And in the first place, it has to be noted that of what may be called the artificial self-inflicted penances, the hair shirts, chainlets, spikes, and pricks, and the scourgings that play so large a part in the history of asceticism and have been so conspicuous in later medieval and modern devotional life. There is no trace whatsoever in St. Benedict's rule, or in his life as told by St. Gregory. It is true that if exhortations and warnings failed, corporal chastisements, flogging, was resorted to in the case of refractory monks, but it was a punishment, not a mortification, and it was not self-inflicted. The practice of self-flagellations, called taking the discipline, did not come into vogue, at any rate in the West, until long after St. Benedict's time, its introduction being associated with the name of St. Peter Damian in the 11th century. Oriental monks, especially in Syria, commonly practiced artificial penances, often outlandish in character, and European monks in Gaul were imitating them, as we learn from Gregory of Tours, binding heavy weights on their backs and carrying chains. All this is quite foreign to St. Benedict's spirit, For St. Gregory tells us that when a neighboring hermit chained himself to a rock, as Simon Stylites had done before sending his pillar, St. Benedict rebuked him, saying, "If thou be God's servant, let the chain of Christ, not any iron chain, hold thee." Now, we come to the other kind of bodily austerities, those that may be called natural and that form the staple of the mortifications of the great Egyptian hermits, the privations of food and drink, of sleep and clothing, exposure to heat and cold, labors undertaken in order to wear down the body. Before St. Benedict, the practice of these bodily austerities had been looked on as a chief means of attaining the spiritual end of the monastic life. But he prescribed for his monks sufficient food, ample sleep, proper clothing. A number of antitheses between his regulations and those of the previously fashionable Egypt monasticism will bring into clear light the changes he made and the spirit underlying them. In the matter of food, he allows to each daily a pound of bread, and orders 2 dishes of cooked food, and a third of fruit or young vegetables, so that he who cannot eat of one may make his meal of the other. As Abbot Dalat says, this menu would have appeared to the fathers of the desert as intended for monks utterly relaxed. He also allows a measure, a half a pint at least, very likely more, of wine daily. The advice and practice of the Egyptian monks was to reduce the quantity of food and drink almost to a minimum. St. Benedict prescribes only frugality and the avoidance of gluttony. In Egypt there was a constant striving to reduce the amount of sleep to the narrowest possible limit, and such battling the sleep and drowsiness was one of their favorite asceticism. St. Benedict allows his monks during the greater part of the year more than 8 hours of unbroken sleep each night, and in the summer 5 or 6 hours by night and a siesta by day. See chapter 12 of the Rule of St. Benedict. In Egypt the monks slept on the bare ground with stones for pillows, or at best on papyrus mats, and whereas Abbot John in Cassian deplores the degeneracy of the times that a blanket may be found in a hermit's cell, a thing I cannot mention without shame, as he says, St. Benedict allows not only a blanket, but mattress, coverlet, and a pillow as well. Abbot Pombo of Nitria laid it down that a monk's clothes should be such that if they were left out on the road, no one would think of taking them. St. Benedict directs that the monks are to get new clothes while the old ones are still fit to be given to the poor. The abbot is to see that the monks' clothes fit them. They are to have warmer clothes in the winter, lighter in summer, and clothes are to be changed for the night and are to be washed. He considers a monk's outfit to consist of 2 cowls or cloaks, 2 tunics, shoes and socks, perhaps gaiters, griddle, knife, pen, needle, handkerchief, and writing tablet. A great contrast with the poverty and nakedness practiced in Egypt. Certain features of the rule appear austere to us in the 20th century. For instance, perpetual abstinence from flesh meat, except in case of sickness, is considered a great austerity today, but to the agricultural laborers of Italy in St. Benedict's time it would have not seemed so, nor would the privation of baths have seemed a hardship to Italian peasants of the 6th century. St. Benedict made his monks rise very early, at about 2 a.m., during the greater part of the year, and still earlier in the summer, but they had gone to bed before dark, and had a long prolonged period of unbroken sleep. The idea often held, even by Benedictines, that the midnight office of the Carthusians, breaking the night's rest into 2 portions, is what St. Benedict intended, is not in accordance with fact. The only feature of the life that probably was severe, even to St. Benedict's monk, was the single meal a day. For about half the year, from Easter till mid-September, there were 2 meals, at midday and in the evening. This would not be considered a severe regimen, even by Italians of the upper classes in our own day. It is the actual practice at Monte Cassino, but from mid-September till Lent there was but 1 meal, at about 2:30 p.m. Here it will be appropriate to quote from a writer who knew Italians and their ways so well as the late Marion Crawford. Breakfast, as we understand it, is the unknown meal in Italy even now. Most people drink a cup of black coffee standing, many eat a morsel of bread or biscuit with it, and get out of doors as soon as they can. but the greediness of an Anglo-Saxon breakfast disgusts all Latins alike, and 2 set meals daily are thought to be enough for anyone, as indeed they are. The hard-working Italian hill peasant will sometimes toast himself a piece of cornbread before going to work and eat it with a few drops of olive oil, and in absence of tea or coffee, the people of the Middle Ages often drank a mouthful of wine on rising, to move the blood, as they said, but that was all. The Lenten regimen, indeed, with its rising at 2 and working in the fields from 9 till 4, without breaking the fast until the single meal in the late afternoon, must have been a severe physical strain on St. Benedict's monks. But in those days, Lent was intended to be a severe physical strain on all Christians, and St. Benedict's single meal shortly before sunset was still the common discipline of the Church for all her children. St. Benedict considered that the manner of life he established in his monastery would be enough, on the physical side, to enable his monks to arrive at the perfection of the monastic life, and so far from encouraging them to try to go beyond the rule by practicing austerities on their own account, he discouraged private venture into asceticism, and made it a point of virtue that the monk should do nothing except the common rule of the monastery and the example of superiors exhorts, and that in all things all should follow the rule as mistress. The only exception St. Benedict tolerated was water drinking. In Lent he encourages each to add something voluntarily to the ordinary duties of our service of God in the way of some ascetical exercise beyond the rule, but even then it was to be indicated to the abbot and undertaken only with his approval and blessing. It may be thought that the point is being unduly labored, but it is vital for any true understanding of St. Benedict, and it has very commonly been misunderstood, even by Benedictines. Not a few Benedictine reforms, especially in the 16th and 17th century, but also in more recent times, have been in great measure based on the idea of restoring the austerity deliberately discarded by St. Benedict. Traces of this misconception of St. Benedict's spirit exist at the present day. On November 13th, Benedictines celebrated a feast sometimes called All Monks, but in the official calendar, All Benedictine Saints. In the hymn occur the following lines: Vobis olus cabria furere vel lugiminae, potumque lympha prepuit, humnusque dura lectilum, vesitistis inter aspides, savusque cum draconibus. For a general feast of all monks, no exception could be taken to the hymn, for Benedictines would only find their place in the great crowd of monks of all kind, fathers of the desert, hermits, Syriac and Celtic monks, and the rest, and it would seem this was the hymn writer's intention. Adverte solitudinis clarusque mites inculae. But for a specifically Benedictine feast, the hymn is singularly ill-chosen, being pitched in a wrong key. For vegetable diet, water drinking, sleeping on the bare ground, living with snakes and dragons, not one of those things, though true of St. Benedict himself in the Sacro Specco, is any part of Benedictine life, and they are all in direct contradiction to the provisions of the rule. Another instance may be produced from our own day. The crypt at Monte Cassino has recently been gorgeously and beautifully decorated by Benedictine monks of the Burin congregation and was solemnly reopened in 1913. In the carvings and reliefs, St. Benedict and his monks are in bare feet, or in some cases with light sandals, like the discalced Carmelites. It will not be questioned that the human foot is a more beautiful object and lends itself more easily to artistic treatment than a boot. But St. Benedict says quite definitely, footgear, whatever be the precise meaning of padules and caligae, probably the 6th century equivalent of socks and shoes. It is regrettable that at Monte Cassino, of all places, so grotesque a notion, and one so alien from St. Benedict's mind as barefooted Benedictines, should even seem to be countenanced. For like reasons, the familiar presentation of St. Benedict in the early Umbrian school, finger on lip and rod in hand, as though silence and chastisement were the keynotes of the rule, though appropriate enough for St. Columban, is, as a symbolizing St. Benedict's spirit, a parody, doubtfully regrettable in such masters as Guido and Perguino, in other cases so sympathetically appreciative of the spirit of the saints. They probably reflected a wave of reforming rigorism in the Benedictine houses around them. To sum up the matter of Benedictine asceticism so far as it concerns the practice of bodily austerities, St. Benedict found monasticism in Italy and in Gaul languishing, sinking under the weight of ideals and practices inherited from the East, but unsuited to Western conditions. To meet the case, he did not gather up what remained still in exercise of the primitive austerities and attempt a restoration of the old ascetic life, but struck out a new line, such as seemed to him more fitting for the times and circumstances. And whereas a strong individualism was the keynote of Egyptian monasticism in all its phases, in Western Europe, hardly less than in Egypt, St. Benedict was a collectivist in the spiritual order. In place of rivalry in aesthetical achievement, he established a common mode of life. In place of rivalry in aesthetical achievement, he established a common mode of life made up of a round of objective duties, none too onerous, common prayer, work, and reading, and the sanctification of the monk was to be found in living the life of the community. This twofold break with the past, and the elimination of austerity and in the sinking of the individual community, made St. Benedict's rule less a development than a revolution in monasticism. It may almost be called a new creation, and it was destined to prove, as the subsequent history shows, peculiarly adapted to the new races that were repeopling Western Europe. St. Benedict's teaching on the spiritual life. If St. Benedict thought, as the event showed, rightly thought, that he could eliminate from the monastic life the element of corporal austerity as it had been understood and practiced before his time, it goes without saying that he by no means supposed asceticism could be dispensed with. Asceticism, as we have seen, means training in the spiritual life, both in the negative aspect of purging from soul and character all that is sinful, imperfect, selfish, and in the positive aspect of cultivating, building up all that is good and holy. It thus embraces mortification and the practice of the virtues, and it is, in effect, that aiming at and tending to perfection that is one of the recognized obligation of the religious life in every form. It is the department of the spiritual life which has to do with ourselves and our own souls, and the process of purification that will make them such as may draw near to God. Though it is impossible to extract from the rule of St. Benedict's teaching on the spiritual life, he nowhere gives any scientific or ordered exposition of a general theory of its course, but such a theory is to be found in Cassian, and Cassian we know was St. Benedict's spiritual book of predilection. In 2 places in the rule he tells his monks to read Cassian, and the index scriptorum to my edition of the rule shows that the references to Cassian are more numerous and also more considerable than to any other author. And if the references be examined, it will appear that St. Benedict was familiar with Cassian's writings, and was saturated with their thought and language in a greater measure than with any other, save only the Holy Scriptures. So in giving Cassian's theory of the spiritual life, we may be sure we are giving the ideas practically accepted by St. Benedict. It is the 14th conference, that of Abbot Nestoros, on spiritual knowledge, that we find a formal exposition of the course of the spiritual life. Bishop Gibson's translation in the Nicene and Post-Nicene Library is followed, the text being compressed. Quote, "Spiritual knowledge is twofold. First, practical, which is brought about by an improvement of morals and purification from faults. Secondly, which consists in the contemplation of things divine and the knowledge of the most sacred thoughts. Whoever would arrive at this theoretical contemplative knowledge must first pursue practical knowledge with all his might and main. For this practical knowledge can be acquired without the contemplative, but the contemplative cannot possibly be gained without the practical. In vain does one strive for the vision of God who does not shun the stains of sin. This practical perfection depends on a double system. For its first method is to know the nature of all faults and the manner of their cure. Its second, to discover the order of the virtues, and form our mind by their perfection. For in what way will one, who has neither succeeded in understanding the nature of his own faults, nor tried to eradicate them, be able to gain an understanding of virtues, which is the second stage of practical training, or the mysteries of spiritual and heavenly things, which exist in the higher stage of contemplative knowledge. The practical life is distributed among many different professions and interests. For some make it their whole purpose to aim at the secrecy of the anchorite, and to be joined to God by the silence of solitude. Some have given all their efforts and interests to the system of the cenobitic life and the care of the brethren. Some are pleased with the kindly service of the guest house and hospitality, as Macarius presided over the guest house in Alexandria, in such a way as to be considered inferior to none of those who aimed at the retirement of the desert. Some chose the care of the sick, others devote themselves to intercession for the afflicted and the oppressed, or give themselves up to teaching or almsgiving to the poor. Wherefore it is good and profitable for each one to endeavor with all his might and main to attain perfection in the work that has been begun, according to the line he has chosen as the grace which he has received, and while he praises and admires the virtues of others, not to swerve from his own line, which he has once for all chosen. For those who are not yet settled in the line which they have taken up are often, when they hear some praise for different pursuits and virtues, so stirred up by the praise of them that they try forthwith to imitate their methods. It is an impossibility for one and the same man to excel at once in all the good deeds enumerated above. In many ways men advance towards God, and so each man should complete that one which he has once fixed upon, never changing the course of his purpose, so that he may be perfect in whatever line of life his may be. Endeavor with all eagerness to gain in the first place a thorough grasp of practical, that is, ethical discipline, for without this, theoretic contemplative purity cannot be obtained." End quote. As used in this passage, the actual life is quite different from the active life of St. Gregory and later writers, for it includes as one of its form the life of hermits. Any form of Christian life may afford the exercising ground for the practice of virtue that is required for Cassian's actual life. One form is the cenobitic life, and this is the form chosen by St. Benedict for his monks. Persevering in God's teaching until death in the monastery, we may by patience share in the sufferings of Christ. Cassian's teaching on the spiritual life is further illustrated in the first conference. Quote, "The end of our profession indeed is the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, but the immediate aim or goal is purity of heart, without which no one can gain that end. Fixing our gaze then steady on this goal, as if on a definite mark, let us direct our course as straight towards it as possible. Whatever can help to guide us to this object, purity of heart, we must follow with all our might, but whatever hinders us from it, we must shun as a dangerous and hurtful thing. 4. For this we do and endure all things. For this we make light of our kinsfolk, our country, honors, riches, the delights of this world, and all kinds of pleasures, namely, in order that we may retain a lasting purity of heart. And so when this object is set before us, we shall always direct our actions and thoughts straight towards the attainment of it. And if it be not constantly fixed before our eyes, all our toils will be vain and useless and endured to no purpose. Everything should be done and sought after by us for the sake of this. For this we must seek, for solitude. For this we know that we ought to be submit to fastings, vigils, toils, bodily nakedness, reading, and all other virtues, that through them we may be enabled to prepare our heart and to keep it unharmed by all evil passions, and resting on these steps to mount to the perfection of charity. Those things which are of secondary importance, such as fastings, vigils, withdrawal from the world, meditation on Scripture, we ought to practice with a view to our main object, purity of heart. Fastings, vigils, meditation on the Scriptures, self-denial, and the abnegation of all possessions are not perfection, but aids to perfection, because the end of that science does not lie in these, but by means of these we arrive at the end." End quote. The following summary of the way up to perfection may also be cited. The beginning of salvation and of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. From the fear of the Lord arises salutary compunction. From compunction of heart springs renunciation, i.e., nakedness and contempt of all possessions. From nakedness is begotten humility. From humility, the mortification of desires. Through mortification of desires, all faults are extirpated and decay. By the driving out of faults, virtues shoot up and increase. By the budding of virtues, purity of heart is gained. By purity of heart, the perfection of the apostolic love is acquired. Institutes chapter 4, verse 43. With this background to St. Benedict's mind, we may come to his own teaching on interior asceticism and the spiritual life. He places asceticism primarily in the renunciation of self-will, and on this he is insistent. As uncompromising as in matters of corporal austerity, he is indulgent. At the very outset, he says to those who would come to the monastic life under his guidance that he addresses such as renounce their own wills. And in the course of the rule, the same idea is insisted on again and again. We are forbidden to do our own will. We must abandon it. We must hate it. We must not through love of our own will take pleasure in carrying out our own desires. No one in the monastery is to follow the will of his own heart, and it is not lawful for monks to have either their bodies or their wills as their own disposal. Finally, St. Benedict's very description of the cenobitical life is as follows. They do not live by their own free will, or obey their own desires and pleasures, but walk by another's judgment and command, and living in monasteries, desire that an abbot be over them. This renunciation of self-will translates itself into action into the three recognized vows of religion. It will express itself ready obedience to another's will, and detachment and poverty, impurity of heart and chastity. Thus, it is the very root of self-discipline and the practice of virtue, or asceticism in its highest acceptance, and by thus singling it out as the thing that above all matters, St. Benedict showed himself as the great religious genius he was. It is the denying oneself, and, as St. Gregory says, quote, "It is less a thing to renounce what one has, but it is an exceeding great thing to renounce what one is." It is to be noticed that he does not say that we are to mortify, to kill our own will, so as to become merely indifferent. This idea is often inculcated by the Egyptian monks and by later religious legislators. It is remarkable that though the words mortificare and mortificatio are common in Cassian, they are nowhere used by St. Benedict. He takes for granted that self-will is always alive in us, as of course it is, and so the most he tells us is to hate it. Could it be once for all destroyed, we should be deprived of the principal means of ascetical discipline. And it is a means that can constantly be used at every moment in things small and great, at every call of duty, when up against any rule, in any trouble, trial, temptation, in all our dealings with others. Everywhere self comes in, everywhere is there self-will to be combated and conquered. It is the overcoming of self, the elimination of selfishness. It is, in short, that self-denial that is the root of the spiritual life. If anyone wish to come after me, let him deny himself. The Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 26, verse 24. And St. Benedict relied on this all-embracing spiritual mortification to effect in his monks that purifying of spirit that is the object of asceticism. When we look at the positive side of asceticism, Cassian's second part of the actual life, the training in virtue, we find that St. Benedict's formal teaching on the spiritual life is contained in the Instruments of Good Works and on humility. We refer once for all to Abbot de Latte's excellent and practical commentary on these two chapters, where their teaching is clearly and solidly brought out. Only certain aspects will be noted here. The instruments are 75 spiritual and moral precepts of miscellaneous character. They include the 10 Commandments and the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, and of the others some are derived from Scripture and a few from other sources, but most have not been traced to any source. The instruments afford a wide and varied field of ascetical training, and St. Benedict gives them to his monks as the instruments or tools of the spiritual art, which are to be used incessantly, day and night, in the workshop of the monastery. And so the declaration of the English congregation direct this chapter often to be read and meditated upon, so that the precepts inculcated in it may always be for us the norm of our life. It is worthy of note that in St. Benedict's instruments there is nothing monastic or religious in the technical sense. They are all mere Christianity, elementary morality, fundamental religion. But any formal presentation by St. Benedict of a theory of the spiritual life must be sought in the greater chapter on humility, which has become a classic in ascetical literature. There is no question of giving any set commentary here, but only the barest indication of the doctrine. Abbot de Latte's commentary may again be referred to, and also the masterly chapter on humility in Father Baker's Sancta Sophia, which seems to bring out the deepest meaning of St. Benedict's teaching, though humility is the word used throughout by St. Benedict. At the beginning it is equated with discipline, which shows that under the term humility is included all that is meant by self-discipline or asceticism. As is well known, St. Benedict marks 12 degrees of humility. The 4th to 11th are in large measure suggested by Cassian, but the first 3 and the last are St. Benedict's own. The first degree embraces the most fundamental truths of religion, which must pervade our minds at all times and be the groundwork of the spiritual life in us: the fear of God and mindfulness of His commandments, the sense that we are always in God's presence, and that all our thoughts and actions lie open to His sight, and the realization that He is at all times present with us. St. Thomas sums up this degree as reverence to God, and declares that it is the root of humility. Humility, indeed, fundamentally is the realization of the truth as regards God, ourselves, and our relation to Him, and the acting on such realization. The next 2 degrees are concerned with renunciation of self-will and obedience, that we love not our own wills, and delight not in fulfilling our own desires, and that for God's love we subject ourselves with all obedience to our superior. And then follow 4 degrees of extreme difficulty, that takes us to the heights of self-conquest, that if in obedience things hard and distasteful, or even what injures soever, are laid upon us, our conscience do silently embrace them, and enduring them do neither grow weary nor fall away. That the monk hide not from his abbot in humble confession his evil thoughts and secret actions, i.e., not as a matter of sacramental confession. That the monk be contented with the meanest and the worst of everything, and whatever be enjoined him, judge himself a bad and worthless workman. That not only with his tongue does he pronounce himself, but also in the inmost feeling of his heart believe himself lower and viler than all others. This last might seem impossible, were it not that in such cases as St. Therese's and others we have example of the holiest souls penetrated by an absolute and sincere conviction that they were the most unworthy and abject of creatures. The last 5 degrees are concerned with the effects of humility on conduct and demeanor. It will be seen that St. Benedict's conception of humility is much wider and deeper than the usual connotation of the word, being the equivalent, as he makes it, of discipline, or training in the spiritual life, so that here we have his full doctrine of asceticism, the exercises he relied on for the formation and growth of his monks in holiness. It is nothing short of renunciation in a heroic degree. Yet St. Benedict is not framing any mere theoretical or academic scheme of virtue. He intends his monks to practice all these degrees of humility, for he says, if we wish, and he manifestly takes for granted that we do, to attain not merely to humility, not merely to a high kind of humility, but to the summit of the highest humility, then must these rungs of the ladder be mounted. And at the end he declares, when all these degrees of humility have been climbed, the monk will straightway come to that perfect love of God which casteth out fear. The Benedictine monk must therefore not look on the difficult degrees as heights out of reach and mere ideals not intended for him. On the contrary, he is required to work seriously all his life as the acquirement of all the degrees of humility, even the highest and hardest. And he has St. Benedict's assurance, an assurance amply vouched for by history, that this spiritual asceticism will do for him as much as the corporal austerities of the older and also of newer monasticism, and will bring him surely to that love of God is the one ultimate object of the monastic life. It will have been noticed that the renunciation St. Benedict calls for always comes back, one way or another, to the renunciation of the will. It is always one's own will that has to be renounced. Nothing is said of renunciation of the affections, and yet this principle of the mortification of the affections under the name of detachment plays a prominent role in modern schools of asceticism and spirituality, and especially in the case of those devoted to the religious life. But such teaching has found its place in asceticism from the beginning, and conspicuously among the monks of Egypt. Probably the great apostle of detachment is the Carmelite mystic St. John of the Cross, the friend of St. Therese, who, in the ascent of Mount Carmel, pursues the matter with scientific method and unrelenting logic through each faculty of the mind, each power of the soul, urging that for the spiritual man no joy, no pleasure in anything, whether natural or spiritual, is admissible, there being nothing in which a man may rejoice except in serving God. Such sentences as the following abound. Quote, "The spiritual Christian ought to suppress all joy in created things because it is offensive in the sight of God. And he shrinks from no deductions. It is vanity for wife and husband to rejoice in marriage or to desire children, for they know not if they shall be servants of God." End quote. Probably no other Christian teacher has pushed the doctrine of detachment to a limit so extreme, but others do teach a similar theory. For instance, Father Augustine Baker, though in the matter of bodily mortification most moderate, in the matter of affections propounds a view of detachment that is a hard saying. The duty of a Christian, much more of a soul that aspires to perfection, is to love nothing at all but God, or in order to him, that is, as a means and instrument to beget and increase his divine love in our souls. All adhesion to creatures by affection, whether such affection be great or small, is accordingly sinful, more or less, so that, if being deprived of any one thing or persons whatsoever, or being pained by anything, we find a trouble and sorrow in our minds for the loss of suffering of the thing itself, such trouble, in what degree soever, argues that our affection was sinful. Not only because the affection was excessive, but because it was an affection, the object whereof was not God. He explains indeed that he means an affection seated in the superior soul or rational will, not one confined to the sensitive nature, and sums up, to the superior will all things but God must be indifferent as in and for themselves, and only to be loved as they are serviceable to the Spirit. Most modern writers would tone down such doctrine and recognize the lawfulness and goodness of the primary natural affections, but in matters of friendship an extreme rigor prevails, especially in the various forms of religious life, so that what is demanded is not so much the regulation and sanctification of the affections as their suppression. Precepts and examples of an extreme detachment are frequent among Egyptian monks, especially in regards to the family relationships and affections. And here it is possible to produce another antithesis, like those of the preceding chapter, illustrating the difference between St. Benedict's ideas and those prevalent in Egypt. Palladius relates of Abbot Prior of Nitria that on leaving his father's house as a young man in order to become a monk, he made a vow never again to see any of his family. And after 50 years, his old sister became possessed with a longing to see him, and begged the bishop to use his influence to make him come out of the desert and visit her. So Prior went to her house, and standing outside, shut his eyes and called to her that he was there, and bade her come out and look at him. And she could not persuade him to enter the house, but praying on the threshold, with closed eyes, he departed again to the desert. What a contrast is this to St. Benedict's treatment of his sister Scholastica! Every year she came to a house near the monastery, and they used to spend the day together till nightfall. And on her death Benedict had her body brought and laid in the grave prepared for himself, so that, as their minds were always one in God, no, their bodies were not separated in the grave. When we examine the rule, we find no exhortation to renunciation of the affections among either the instruments of good works or the degrees of humility. St. Benedict warns the abbot must not love one more than another, except him whom he finds better in good actions and obedience. He is to love his monks, and to try to win their affections, and the monks in turn should love their abbot with sincere and humble love. The elder monks are to love the younger, and the younger to obey the elder with all charity, and all are to cherish fraternal charity with love chastely. There is no ground for supposing that in these passages the words delegare, amare do not bear their real meaning of love. On the contrary, they suggest that the great natural family relations and affections were intended by St. Benedict to hold sway in his spiritual family. The love of father for sons sway in his spiritual family. The love of father for sons and son for father, and brothers for one another, after the example of the mutual love of Benedict and Scholastica. There is no sure interpretation of the spirit of a religious rule than the practice of the saints who lived under it. St. Bernard's theory of natural affection and detachment stands out clear in the lament on the death of his own brother Gerard, a monk with him at Clairvaux. Quote, St. Bernard, "My very bowels are torn away, and it is said to me, 'Do not feel any pain.' But I do feel pain, and that in spite of myself. I have not the insensibility of a stone, nor is my flesh of bronze. I have feeling assuredly, and sharp pain, and my trouble is ever in my sight. I have confessed my great affliction, and denied it not. Someone has called this carnal. I do not deny that it is human, just as I do not deny that I am a man. If that does not suffice, then I shall not deny that it is carnal. Nevertheless, I do not desire to oppose at all the decrees of the Holy One. It is reasonable to declare that I call in question the sentence because I feel the penalty keenly. To feel is human, but to repine would be impious. It is human, I repeat, and unavoidable that we should not be indifferent to those who are our friends, that we should enjoy their presence and lament it being taken from us. Social intercourse, particularly among friends, will not be tedious. The reluctance to separate, and the pain which is felt by each when separated, shows plainly the effect that their mutual affection has had upon those who live together. St. Bernard clearly does not come up to the standard of detachment required by St. John of the Cross and Father Baker, and the above, be it noted, was spoken to his monks. In the introduction to The Monks of the Lest, Montalembert speaks on the subject of friendship in the cloister. He brings forward not only from St. Bernard, but from St. Anselm and many other great figures in Benedictine history, passages, some of a southern warmth of expression, which show how real, how devoted, how truly human were the affections they did not hesitate to entertain and give scope to. Yet St. Bernard and St. Anselm were saints, and stand out as strong men in an age when men were strong. This shows that the kind of detachment called for by St. John of the Cross and many modern spiritual writers is at any rate not necessary for sanctity. At most, it is only one kind of holiness. There is another to be obtained without it, which lies not in the suppression, but in the due regulation and sanctification of affections. And the example of the great Benedictine saints, including St. Benedict himself, the indications of the rule, and the analogies of St. Benedict's attitude to bodily austerities, which is one of temperance, not total abstinence, all lead to the conclusion that the latter is the authentic Benedictine idea of detachment. Both views can find support in the Gospels. There are utterances of our Lord that seem to call for detachment, even the most rigorous. On the other hand, we are allowed to see that he had his human friendships and gave scope to his human affections, and the appeal to the example of our Lord brings us to the final touchstone of the spiritual life, which in all its forms must be for Christians a following of Christ. This St. Benedict knew well, and so his rule begins with Christ, ever dwells on Christ, and ends with him. The aspirant to the monastic life is addressed as one going to serve as a soldier of Christ. The monk it is by faith to see Christ in all, in the abbot, in the guests, in the poor, in the sick. In self-denial he follows Christ. In obedience he imitates him. By patience he shares his sufferings. By love of him will he come to perfect charity. He is to place nothing before the love of Christ, nor deem anything dearer to him than Christ. And finally, the last words of the rule proper, for the final chapter is an appendix, are that he is to prefer nothing whatsoever to Christ. And this is the sum of St. Benedict's teaching on the spiritual life.
The Medal or Cross of St. Benedict. Its Origin, Meaning, and Privileges, by the Abbot Prosper Garanger, published in 1880. On the figure of the cross represented in the medal. There is a great wish on the part of many Catholics to have clear ideas regarding the celebrated medal, which goes under the name of the Great Patriarch of the Monks of the West. It is true that several notices, some more, some less correct, have been already published, but none of them, so it seems to us, having fully satisfied the wishes of the faithful, we thought it could be well to offer to their devotion a more complete explanation of an object which has become so dear to them. That there may be order in what we are going to say about it, we will begin with the description of the medal. A Christian needs but reflect for a moment on the sovereign virtues of the cross of Jesus Christ, in order to understand how worthy of respect a medal is on which it is represented. The cross was the instrument of the world's redemption. It is the saving tree whereon was expiated the sin committed by man, when he ate the fruit of the forbidden tree. St. Paul tells us that the sentence of our condemnation was fastened to the cross and blotted out by the blood of our Redeemer. In a word, the cross, which the Church salutes as our only hope, is to appear on the last day in the clouds of heaven as the trophy of the victory of the man-God. The image of the cross excites in our minds the liveliest sentiments of gratitude towards God for the benefit of our salvation. After the Blessed Sacrament, there is nothing on earth so deserving of our respect as the cross, and it is for this reason that we pay it a worship of adoration which was referred to God, whose precious blood was spilt upon it. Animated by sentiments of the purest religion, the primitive Christians had, from the very beginning of the Church, the profoundest veneration for the image of the cross, and the Fathers seem never to tire in the praises they give to this august sign. When after 300 years of persecution, God had decreed to give peace to his Church, there appeared in the heavens a cross, on which were these words, "In this sign shalt thou conquer," and the Emperor Constantine, to whom was granted this vision, promising him victory over his enemies, would henceforth have his army go to battle under a standard bearing the image of the cross with the monogram of the word Christ. This standard was called the labarum. The cross is an object of terror to the evil spirits. They ever crouch in terror before it. They no sooner ace it than let go their prey and take it to flight. In a word, of such importance to Christians is the cross and the blessing it brings along with it, that from the times of the apostles down to our age, the faithful have ever been accustomed frequently to make the sign of the cross upon themselves, and the priests of the Church have constantly used it over all the objects which, in virtue of their sacerdotal character, they have the power to bless and sanctify. Our medal, therefore, which firstly offers to us the figure of the cross, is in strict accordance with Christian piety, and worthy, even were there no other motive than this, of all possible veneration. Of the effigy of St. Benedict represented on the medal. The honor of appearing on the same medal with the figure of the Holy Cross has been given to St. Benedict, with the intention of expressing the efficacy which this holy sign had when made by his venerable hand. St. Gregory the Great, who has written the life of the Holy Patriarch, tells us how, by the sign of the cross, he overcame his temptations, and by the same sign broke the cup of poisoned drink which was offered to him, thus unmasking the wicked designs of those who had plotted to take away his life. When the evil spirit, in order to terrify his religious, made the monastery of Monte Cassino appear to be on fire, St. Benedict immediately dispels the artifice by making over the fiery phantom this sign of our Redeemer's passion. When his religious are troubled interiorly with the suggestions of the tempter, the Holy Father bids them take the remedy, and it is to make on their breasts the sign of the cross. In his rule he prescribes that the brother, who has been reading the solemn engagement of his profession at the foot of the altar, should immediately affix to it the sign of the cross, as an irrevocable seal of the deed on which his vows are written. The disciples of St. Benedict have had a like confidence in this sacred sign, and have worked innumerable miracles by it. Let it here suffice to mention St. Maurus giving sight to a blind man, St. Placid curing many who were sick, St. Richemere liberating captives, St. Wulstan preserving a workman in the very act of falling from the top of the church tower, St. Odilo drawing out from a man's eye a splinter of wood which had run through it, St. Anselm of Canterbury driving away from an old man the horrid spectres which were tormenting him in his dying moments, St. Hugh of Cluny quelling a storm, St. Gregory the Seventh arresting the conflagration of Rome. These, and 1,000 other such miracles, which are related in the Acts of the Saints of the Order of St. Benedict, were all worked by the sign of the cross. The glory and efficacy of the august instrument of our salvation have been celebrated with enthusiasm by the children of the great patriarch. They loved to extol it, for their hearts were full of gratitude towards it, not to speak of the little office of the Holy Cross, which St. Olderic, Bishop of Augsburg, used to recite, and which was also in choir in the abbeys of St. Gall, of Richelieu, of Bursfield. The blessed Rabanus Maurus and St. Peter Damian consecrated their talent for poetry and singing the praises of the Holy Cross. St. Anselm of Canterbury has written its praises in the form of the most exquisite prayers. Venerable Bede, St. Odilo of Cluny, Rupert of Deutz, Egbert of Schoningen, and a long list of others of the order have left us sermons on the Holy Cross. Ignhard wrote a book in defense of the worship paid to it against the iconoclasts, and Peter the Venerable defended it in a set treatise, the use of the sign of the cross, which had been attacked by the Petrobutians. A great number of the most famous monasteries of the Order of St. Benedict were founded under the title of Holy Cross. Of these, let it suffice to mention the celebrated monastery built at Paris by the bishop St. Germanus, the monastery built by St. Farron in the diocese of Meaux, the Abbey of the Holy Cross founded at Poitiers by St. Radegonde, the monastery of Holy Cross at Bordeaux built by Clovis II, those of Metten in Bavaria, Richelieu in Switzerland, Quimperé in Brittany, and the 5 famous monasteries in the Vosgian county which were founded by St. Hidrulf, and which he also situated that they formed a cross. The Saviour of the world seems to have entrusted, by a special favor, to the children of St. Benedict a large portion of the cross on which he died for the redemption of man. Large fragments of this sacred wood have been confided to their keeping, and a Christian might almost glory in having seen the instrument of his salvation, were all the pieces to be put before him, which have been possessed by different monasteries of this order. We may mention the following amongst the houses thus privileged. In France, Saint Germain des Prés; in Paris, Saint Denis; Holy Cross at Poitiers; Cormery in Touraine; Gelon; Saint Michael's de Murano in Venice; Sahagnu in Spain; Richelieu in Switzerland; Saint Ulrich's and Saint Afra's in Augsburg in Germany; Saint Michael's at Hildesheim; Saint Tertbert's in the Black Forest; Moloch in Austria; and the celebrated monastery of Ganzrim. But the most glorious mission given to the Benedictines in what relates to the glory of the Holy Cross is that of having carried this instrument of salvation into so many countries by preaching the gospel to their pagan inhabitants. The greater part of the West was converted by their zeal from the darkness of infidelity, and the reader need scarce be told that England was converted by St. Augustine of Canterbury, Germany by St. Boniface, Belgium by St. Amandus, Holland and Zealand by St. Willibord, Westphalia by St. Swithbert, Sweden and Denmark by St. Ansgararus, Austria by St. Wolfgang, Saxony by St. Ludgerius, Bavaria by St. Corbian, Poland and Bohemia by St. Adalbert of Prague, Prussia by St. Otho of Bamberg, Russia by St. Boniface II. Such are, in brief, the facts which give to the person the name of St. Benedict a special connection with the Holy Cross. It is, therefore, with a most evident appropriateness that the effigy of this holy patriarch has been put on the same medal with the figure of the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. We see still more clearly why this should have been done when we refer to what is related in the Acts of the 2 great disciples of this servant of God, St. Placid and St. Maurus. Both of them, when working the miracles, which we meet with in almost every page of their lives, were wont to join together with the invocation of the Holy Cross the name of their Holy Father, Benedict, thus establishing at the very beginning of the order the pious practice of which the medal was to be, in after times, the symbol and the expression. St. Placid had scarcely bidden farewell to the holy patriarch on leaving Monte Cassino to repair to Sicily, when arriving at Capua he was besought to heal the dean of the church of that town. His humility made for a long time resist such a demand. At length he consents, and placing his hand upon the head of the priest, who was sick of a mortal disease, he immediately cures him, whilst pronouncing these words, "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, by the prayers and virtue of Benedict our Master, drew me safe and sound from the midst of the water, may God reward thy faith and restore thee to thy former health." Immediately there comes a blind man, begging in his turn to be cured. Placid makes the sign of the cross upon his eyes, at the same time adding this prayer, "Lord Jesus Christ, mediator of God and man, who didst come down from heaven to earth, that thou mightest enlighten those who were sitting in the darkness and shades of death, thou who hast given to our blessed Master Benedict the gift of healing all maladies and all wounds, deign, by his merits, to give sight to this blind man, to the end that, seeing the magnificence of thy works, he may fear and adore thee as the sovereign Lord." Then addressing himself to the blind man, Placid thus continued, "By the merits of our most holy Father Benedict, I command thee, in the name of him who created the sun and moon to be the ornament of the heavens, and gave to him who was born blind the eyes which nature had denied him, arise, and be thou healed. Go now, and tell all men the wonderful works of our God." The blind man immediately recovered his sight. We might quote several other miracles from the life of St. Placid, such as healing the sick or driving out the devils from those possessed, in which the invocation or mention of St. Benedict, still living, was united with the miracles of the sign of the cross. In some of these miracles we find the sick themselves acknowledging and proclaiming this mysterious connection. St. Maurus, having been sent by the great patriarch into Gaul, there to establish his rule, soon began to work numerous miracles. As we noticed before, these miracles were wrought by means of the Holy Cross, but the saintly abbot was also accustomed to join to the divine virtue of the instrument of our redemption a prayer invoking the intervention of St. Benedict. He bore testimony to himself when, on occasion of his having saved one of his fellow travelers from death, he made this declaration, "If," said the saint to those who had witnessed the miracle, "the divine majesty hath deigned to work this miracle by the wood which redeemed us, it is plainly not to man, but to the Redeemer himself we must give the glory of it, although none of you can doubt, but that the merits of our most holy Father Benedict have obtained this grace of him for us." From these facts it is evident, even from the very commencement of the Benedictine order, this method, having recourse to the divine goodness, was practiced with wonderful success. Saint Benedict was still on earth, and his disciples invoked his name when they were asking favors of heaven. If such confidence in his merits was, even then, thus blessed by God, how great must the power of his intercession be now that he has been raised to his throne of glory in heaven. Of the letters which are inscribed on the medal. Besides the two figures of the cross and of Saint Benedict, there are also inscribed on the medal a certain number of letters, each of which is the initial of a Latin word. These words compose one or two sentences, which explain the medal and its object. They express the relation existing between the holy patriarch of the monks of the West and the sacred sign of the salvation of mankind, at the same time that they offer the faithful a formula which they may make use of for employing the virtue of the Holy Cross against the evil spirits. These mysterious letters are arranged on the side of the medal on which the cross is. Let us begin by noticing the four which are placed in the angles formed by the arms of the cross. C, S, P, B. They signified Crux Sancte Patris Benedicti, in English, the cross of our Holy Father Benedict. These words explain the nature of the medal. On the perpendicular line of the cross itself are these letters, CSSML. They stand for the words Crux Sacra Sit Mihi Lux, in English, May the Holy Cross be my light. On the horizontal line of the cross are these letters, NDSMD. The words which they imply are Non Draco Sit Mihi Dux, in English, Let not the dragon be my guide. These two lines put together form a pentameter verse, containing the Christian's protestation that he confides in the Holy Cross and refuses to bear the yoke which the devil would put upon him. On the rim of the medal there are inscribed several other letters, and the first well-known monogram of the Holy Name of Jesus, IHS. Faith and our own experience convince us of all the all-powerfulness of this divine name. Then, following, beginning at the right hand, the following letters, VRSNSMV SMQLIVB. These initials stand for the two following verses, Vade retro Santana, nunquam suad mihi vana, sunt mala qui libas, ipse venene bibas. In English, Begone, Satan, and suggest not to me thy vain things. The cup thou offerest me is evil. Drink thou thy poison. These words are supposed to be uttered by St. Benedict, those of the first verse when he was suffering the temptations in his cave, and which he overcame by the sign of the cross, and those of the second verse at the moment of his enemies offering him the draught of death, which he discovered by his making over the poisoned cup the sign of life. The Christians may make use of these same words as often as he finds himself tormented by the temptations and insults of the invisible enemy of our salvation. Our Saviour sanctified the first of these words by himself making use of them, Begone, Satan, Vade retro Santana. Their efficacy has thus been tested, and the very gospel is the guarantee of their power. The vain things to which the devil incites us are disobedience to the law of God. They are also the pomps and false maxims of the world. The cup offered us by this angel of darkness is evil, that is, sin, which brings death to the soul. Instead of receiving it at his hands, we ought to bid him keep it to himself, for it is the inheritance which he chose for himself. The Christian who reads these pages needs not that we should enter into a long explanation of this formula, which meets the artifices and violence of Satan with what he most dreads, namely, the cross, the holy name of Jesus, our Saviour's own words in his temptation, and lastly, the mention of the victories which the great patriarch St. Benedict gained over the infernal dragon. We need only pronounce these words of the medal with faith, and we shall immediately feel ourselves strengthened and encouraged to resist all that hell can do against us. Even did we know none of the countless facts which show us how strangely Satan fears this medal, the mere knowledge of what it means and what it expresses would be sufficient to make us look upon it as one of the most powerful arms which the goodness of God has put into our hands against the malice of the devils. Origin of the Medal of St. Benedict. It would be impossible to say at what precise period the faithful began to make use of the medal which we have just described. All we can do is to state the circumstances which caused it to become so widely spread in the Church, and elicited for it the express approbation of the Holy See. In the year 1647, at Natremberg in Bavaria, certain witches, who were accused of having exercised their spells to the injury of the people of the neighborhood, were put into prison by the authorities. In the examination which they were put at their trial, they confessed that their superstitious practices had never been able to produce any effect wherever there was an image of the Holy Cross either hung up or hidden underground. They added that they had never been able to exercise any power over the monastery of Metten, and this circumstance had made them feel sure that the house was protected by the cross. The magistrates questioned the Benedictine monks of Metten on the subject. Search was made in the monastery, and their attention was at length fixed upon several representations of the Holy Cross painted on the walls, and together with the cross were found the letters which we have been describing. These paintings were very ancient, but for years they had been passed by without notice. How, then, were the letters to be explained? No one in the house knew what they meant, and yet they alone could explain the reason of these crosses having been painted in this particular manner. After many previous researches, they came to examine a manuscript belonging to the library of the monasteries. It was an Evangelium, or Book of the Gospels, remarkable for its binding, which was inlaid with relics and precious stones. On the first page were written 13 verses, telling the reader that this book was written and thus ornamented by order of Abbot Peter in the year 1415. At the end of this manuscript there was the book of Rabanus Marus on the cross, and several pen and ink drawings made by one of the monks of Metten, who had concealed his name. One of these drawings represented St. Benedict in a monk's cowl, holding in his right hand a staff, the end of which was formed into a cross. On the staff was written the verse, Crux sacra sit mihi lux, non draco sint mihi dux. The holy patriarch was holding in his left hand a banner on which was inscribed these two other lines, Vade retro satana nuc sude mihi vana, sunt mala qui libas ipse veneni bibas. So that at the beginning of the 15th century, St. Benedict was represented holding a cross, and the verses, the initials of which we are now found on the medal, were known even at that time. These verses must have been at this period regarded as an object of special devotion, since the painting of the cross on the walls of the Metten monastery were encircled with their initial letters. At the same time, it is evident that the reason of these crosses having been placed on the walls had been lost sight of, and that the rich Evangelium, which we have just described from Dom Bernard Pez, had been almost forgotten, until an unexpected circumstance induced the monks to search in it for an explanation of the mysterious letters. We cannot be surprised at this carelessness if we remember the vicissitudes through which the monasteries of Germany had passed for upwards of a century, owing to the religious and political disturbances which had taken place in that country, and which had caused the suppression of so many of the monasteries, leaving the remainder in a wretched and precarious state. But here the question presents itself, when was the practice first introduced of representing St. Benedict with the Holy Cross? In answer, we may fairly quote, as some kind of origin to this practice, the very characteristic facts which we have already given from the lives of Saints Placid and Marus, those first founders of the traditions of the Benedictine order. From these instances we learn how both of these saints performed their miracles by associating to the power of the Holy Cross the merits of their master St. Benedict. But we may also find a further clue to this question in the fact related in the life of Pope St. Leo IX, who governed the Church from 1049 to 1054. The Holy Pontiff was born in the year 1002. His name was Bruno, and during his childhood he was put under the care of Berthold, Bishop of Toll. Being on a visit to some relations at the castle of Ixheim, he was sleeping one night, it was between Saturday and Sunday, in the room which had been allotted to him. During his sleep, a frightful toad came and crept on his face. It put one of its forefeet on his ear and the other under its chin, and then, violently pressing his face, began to suck his flesh. The pressure and pain awoke Bruno. Alarmed at the danger to which he was exposed, he immediately rose from his bed, and with his hand knocked away from his ear the horrid reptile which the moonlight enabled him to see. He immediately began to scream with fright, and several servants were soon in his room with lights, but the venomous reptile had disappeared. They searched for it every corner of the room, but to no purpose, so that they were inclined to look upon the whole matter as a mere imagination of the boy. Be this as it may, the consequences were cruel realities, for Bruno immediately felt his face, throat, and breast begin to be inflamed, and he was soon reduced to an extremely dangerous state. For 2 months did his afflicted parents sit by his bedside, expecting every day to be his last, but at length God, who destined him to become the pillar of his church, put an end to their anxiety by restoring him to health. For 8 days he had been speechless, when on a sudden, whilst perfectly awake, he saw a shining ladder which seemed to go from his bed, and then passing through the window of his room, reached up to heaven. A venerable old man, clothed in the monastic habit, and encircled with a brilliant light, descended by this ladder. He held in his right hand a cross, which was fastened to the end of a long staff. Coming close up to the sick man, he put his left hand on the ladder, and with his right hand placed the cross which he was carrying on Bruno's face, and afterwards on the other parts which were inflamed. This touch caused the venom to issue through an opening which was then and there formed near the ear. The old man then departed by the same way by which he had come, leaving the sick man with the certainty of his recovery. Bruno lost no time in calling his attendant, Adalberon, who was a cleric. He made him sit on his bed, and related to him the joyful visit which he had just received. The sadness which had overwhelmed the family was changed into an extreme joy, and in a few days the wound was healed and Bruno restored to perfect health. Ever after he loved to recount this miraculous event, and the Archdeacon Wibert, to whom we are indebted for this history, assures us that the pontiff was convinced that the venerable old man who had cured him by the touch of the Holy Cross was the glorious patriarch Saint Benedict. Such are the facts as we find them related in the Acts of St. Leo IX, given by Dom Mabillon in his 6th Benedictine century. This history forces us to make two equally natural conjectures. First, the reason of Bruno's recognizing Saint Benedict in the venerable figure which appeared to him with a cross in his hand, which, because it was the custom of those times to represent the holy legislator as bearing the sign of our redemption, and secondly, the event which we have here related, having happened to a man whose influence in the Church was so great, and who entertained such warm gratitude towards the holy patriarch who had healed him by the cross, must have confirmed, and perhaps even originated in Germany more particularly, where St. Leo IX passed the greater part of his life, the custom of making the cross an emblem of St. Benedict, since it was the instrument whereby he worked so many wonders. The manuscript of the Metten monastery is a monument which bears witness to such being the case, and the verses which surrounded the effigy of the holy patriarch were not merely the manual labor of the anonymous writer, but a venerable formula, which was famous even then, since the initial letters of each word in the verses were found painted, in several parts of the same monastery, round the image of the cross, and this too so long before, that in the year 1647 the monks were not able to explain what the letters meant. The affair at Nattrenberg roused the devotion of the country towards Saint Benedict and his cross, in order to secure to the faithful the protection granted by heaven to those who venerate the sacred cross united with the holy patriarch of the Western monks. Certain pious persons began to multiply and distribute, wherever they could, the august symbol which are found on the medal. To the figure of the cross and the effigy of Saint Benedict they added the letters which have been explained by the Metten manuscript. From Germany, where the medal was first struck off, it was soon propagated into every part of Catholic Europe, and was looked upon by the faithful as a sure protection against the infernal spirits. St. Vincent of Paul, who died in 1660, seems to have known this medal, for his Sisters of Charity have always worn it attached to their beads, and for many years it was only made, at least in France, for them. Of the use to be made of the medal of St. Benedict, after having described the medal of St. Benedict and given its origin, we will now explain the use which is to be made of it and the advantages to be derived from it. We are aware that in this age of ours, when the devil is thought by many to be an imaginary rather than a real thing, it will seem to be as strange that a medal should be made and blessed and used as a preservative against the power of the wicked spirit. And yet the Holy Scriptures give us abundant instructions upon the ever-busy power of the devils, as also upon the dangers to which we are exposed, both in soul and body, by the snares they set for us. The not believing in the existence of devils, or those ridiculing of the accounts of which they are told of their operations, is not enough to destroy their power, and, in spite of this incredulity, the air is filled with legions of these spirits of wickedness, as St. Paul teaches us. Were it not that God protected us by the ministry of the holy angels, and this generally without our being aware of it, it would be impossible for us to escape the countless snares of these enemies of all God's creatures. But if there ever were a time when it would seem to be superfluous to prove this existence of wicked spirits, it is now, when we find reappearing amongst us those dangerous and sinful practices which were used by the pagans of old, and now again by Christians, for the purpose of eliciting an answer from spirits, though these can be no other than evil and lying ones. Surely our age is credulous enough in the existence of devils, when we find it so fashionable to be using once again all those consultings of the dead, and oracles and superstitions which Satan employed for keeping men under his power during so many 100 years. Now such is the power of the Holy Cross against Satan and his legions, that we may look upon it as the invincible shield which makes us invulnerable against all their darts. The brazen serpent raised up in the desert by Moses, in order to cure those who have been stung by the fiery serpents, is given to us by our Saviour himself as a figure of his cross. The mark made on the house doors with the blood of the Paschal Lamb by the Israelites preserved them from the terrible visit of the destroying angel. The prophet Ezekiel tells us that they were God's elect, who had thau on their foreheads, and it is the same mark which St. John in his Apocalypse calls the sign of the Lamb. It would even seem that the pagans had some idea of the power which this sacred sign were to exercise, at some future period, against the devils. For on occasion of the destruction of the temple of Serapis of Alexandria under the Emperor Theodosius, there were found engraven upon its foundations the letters thou, which is the figure of the cross, and the symbol which was venerated by the pagans as expressive of the future life. The very adorers of the Serapis used to say, agreeable to a tradition which they had, that when this symbol should be made known to the world, idolatry would cease. History informs us that the pagan mysteries were sometimes rendered powerless on account of there being in the crowd a Christian who made the sign of the cross. Tertullian tells us in his Apology that even pagans, who had witnessed what wonders the Christians wrought by the cross, would themselves successfully employ this mysterious sign against the artifices and attacks of the wicked spirits. St. Augustine assures us that the same was done in his time. Nor ought we, says he, to be astonished at this. These men are, it is true, strangers who have not joined our ranks, but it is the power of our great King which makes itself felt on these occasions. After the triumph of the Church, the great doctor, St. Athanasius, thus expressed his own convictions and confidence in the reference to this important subject. The sign of the cross, he says, has the power of dispelling all the secret charms of magic, and of rendering harmless all the deadly draughts it employs. Let anyone but try what I say. Let him make the sign of the cross in the midst of demons, and of pretended oracles and magic spells. Let him invoke the name of Christ, and he will see for himself how the devils fly from this sign and this name, how the oracles are struck dumb, and how magic and its pillators lose their power. So that this power of the cross is, at the same time, an historical truth, and a dogma of our faith, and it is only because our faith is weak that we seldom have recourse to it, and so seldom experience help from it. The snares of Satan are laid for us on every side. We are surrounded by dangers both of soul and body. Let us imitate those early Christians and defend ourselves by making a more frequent use of the sign of the cross. Will the happy time ever come again for our country, when we shall be allowed to have the crucifix as our protection in our towns and highways and fields, and be permitted to reverence it in our public squares as well as in our own houses, and not be insulted for wearing it openly on our breasts, besides loving it secretly in our heart? And now, applying these considerations to the medal which is the subject of these pages, we come to this conclusion, that it must be profitable to us to use with faith the medal of St. Benedict on occasions when we have reason to fear the snares of the enemy. Its protection will infallibly prove efficacious in every kind of temptation. Numerous and undeniable facts attest its powerful efficacy on 1,000 different occasions in which the faithful had reason to apprehend a danger, either from the direct agency of Satan or from the effects of certain evil practices. We may also employ it in favor of others as a means of preserving or delivering them from dangers which we foresee as threatening them. Unforeseen accidents may happen to us on land or on sea. Let us carry about us this holy medal with faith, and we shall be protected. Even the most trivial circumstances, and in those interests which regard solely man's temporal well-being, the efficacy of the Holy Cross and the power of St. Benedict have been felt. For example, the wicked spirits, in their hatred of man, sometimes molest the animals which God has created for our service, or infest the various articles of nourishment which the same Providence has given to us. Or again, it is not infrequently that the case of our bodily sufferings are caused or protracted by the influence of these our cruel enemies. Experience has proved that the medal of St. Benedict, made use of with a proper intention and with prayer, has frequently broken the snares of the devil, procured a visible improvement in the cases of sickness, and sometimes even effected a complete cure. The miraculous effects of the medal of St. Benedict in the 17th century. Though the medal of St. Benedict has been given to the faithful as a protection in the various necessities in which they may be at any time placed, yet, as its use is only private, and almost always secret, we cannot be surprised that there has never been published an official account of the salutary effects it has produced. We are going, however, to mention some few facts which attested its powerful efficacy during the 17th century, the period of its first introduction into France. We take them from the pious and learned Bucelin in his Benedictus Redivivus. The medal, which had become well known throughout Germany after the event at Nautrenburg, passed into France through the province of Franche-Comté. In 1665, at Luxeuil in France, a young man possessed by the wicked spirit was most cruelly tormented. His parents had employed every means to free him from this state, but all had failed. In this extremity, it came into their minds to have recourse to the medal of St. Benedict. They made their son drink some water into which they had dipped the medal. Scarcely had the boys raised the cups to his lips that the devil began to torment his victim with such unusual violence that the bystanders were struck with terror. The parents, however, were consoled by hearing the devil declare, by the mouth of their son, that he felt himself controlled by a superior power, and that he would go out of the boy at the 3rd hour of the night. So in effect it happened. The infernal spirit went out at the time mentioned, and the boy was restored to peace of mind and health of body. The following fact took place at Luxeuil about the same time. A young girl was irresistibly compelled by the wicked spirit to utter, at every turn, the most obscene words. One would have thought that the devil had taken up his abode on the lips of his victim. In order to free her from this violence of the enemy of every virtue, her friends gave her also some water to drink, which had been sanctified by contrast with the medal of St. Benedict. Immediately she felt herself freed from this wretched compulsion, nor did she ever after transgress in her words the rules of Christian modesty. The same year, 1665, there was a man who had a sore on his arm, but so large and so inflamed that no remedy seemed to have any effect on it. It was suggested that the next time the sore was dressed, there should be also tied to his arm a medal of St. Benedict. This was done, and the next day, on taking off the bandages, the sore was found to be in a healthy state, and after a few days was perfectly healed. About the same time, another sick man was reduced to such a state that nothing seemed to give him relief, and he was despaired of. In this sad condition, he asked to be given to drink some water in which the medal of St. Benedict had been dipped, and very soon afterwards he was restored to perfect health. In the year 1666, the castle of Malut, not many miles from Besancon, was infested by devils. Its inmates were being continually alarmed by hearing strange noises, and numbers of their cattle were dying from unknown distempters. At length, such was the terror that the building was abandoned. Some pious persons recommended the medal of St. Benedict being hung up on there on the walls of the castle, and the event justified their confidence. Instantly all cause of fear disappeared, the house was perfectly quiet, and the inmates lived in it henceforth without being molested. In 1665, a village of Lorraine was being laid waste by frequent fires. Every day some house was burnt down, and no one could discover any cause for these destructive fires. After 12 houses had been thus destroyed, the inhabitants went into despair to a neighboring monastery, and asked what they had better do under this calamity. The monks gave them several medals of St. Benedict, advising them to hang them on the walls of the houses which were still spared. The villagers followed this advice, and from that time they had no more cause to fear further ravages from fire. In a certain part of Burgundy a distemper broke out amongst the cattle, and so virulent was it that the cows gave blood instead of milk. they were perfectly cured of being made to drink water in which the medal of St. Benedict had been put. This fact happened in the year 1665. The owner of a brick kiln complained of not being able to bake the clay, no matter how intensely the kiln was heated. A medal of St. Benedict was fastened to the wall. The fire immediately regained its power, nor did the unnatural phenomenon again appear. This event happened about the same year as the last. The effects of the medal of St. Benedict in the 19th century, cures obtained by it. During the last few years, the grace of God has produced a change in the minds of the faithful of these northern countries, by reanimating many of them with a respect for what is supernatural. This also, in its turn, revived confidence in the holy practices from which our ancestors received so many blessings. The medal of St. Benedict, which was on the point of becoming a secret, known only by a few pious souls, has now been brought so much into notice that thousands have recourse to it in their necessities, and their confidence has been rewarded. We proceed to give several instances of the protection granted to those who have used this holy medal, and we begin by those which relate to the cure of bodily ailments. In the early part of July in the year 1843, a lady who was taking the waters of Therese was suddenly seized with a violent bleeding at the nose. The doctor is called in. He perceives the danger, but the remedies he prescribes for stopping the bleeding only seem to increase it. Things continue in this state till the evening of the third day, when, at 9 o'clock, the danger visibly increases, and the doctor can no longer conceal his fears. The landlady of the hotel goes out of the room in a state of great excitement, and, as if by inspiration, she asks if anyone in the house has a medal of St. Benedict. Fortunately, one is found. The sick person, who was a woman of strong faith, accepts the medal, and immediately the bleeding stops. She washes her hands and face, and goes to lie down, which she had not been able to do for 3 days and 2 nights. The person who had lent the medal found, on returning home, a letter dated Rome, July 8, 1843, in which was written, "I have not yet been able to meet with the book of the Benedictine of Prague. However, I send you a little book on the same subject, given me by our Benedictines of Rome. Now in the list given in this little book of the miraculous effects of the medal of St. Benedict, we read this amongst the rest. It is a most efficacious remedy against hemorrhage." About the same time a young person who was laid with the typhus fever had been obliged to sit for 10 years in an armchair, as the reclining position of lying in bed had become insufferable. At 9 in the evening, the friend of the family who had come to see her spoke to her of St. Benedict's medal, and slipped one into her handkerchief. Scarce 5 minutes had elapsed, when a sick person got into bed, and on the morrow, after sleeping soundly during the whole night, found herself perfectly recovered from the terrible fever, which up to that time had baffled all the skill of the doctors. In January of 1849, a Jesuit father, called to the house of an intimate friend who lived close by, asked him if he could recommend a cure for a toothache, which was almost driving him mad. The friend began to tell him about St. Benedict's medal. After a short explanation of it, the father accepts one. The very moment it touches his hand he utters a cry, like that which dentists often hear from their patients, and then says, "My tooth is broken." He puts his finger on the place, and surprised to find the tooth all right, and the aching gone. In 1858, a Benedictine of St. Paul's in Rome, having heard that a child, to which he had stood godfather, had been taken dangerously ill at Juliers in Rennes, Prussia, sent to the mother a medal of St. Benedict. Inflammation of the lungs, accompanied by spasms in the stomach, gradually reduced the child to the last extremity. One night, the mother, seeing the child almost at the point of death, was suddenly reminded to make use of the medal which she had received a few days before. Distracted with grief and trembling with anxiety, she lays the medal on her child's breast, and then throws herself on her knees at the foot of the bed in fervent prayer. That very moment the poor little sufferer quietly fell asleep, and after some hours of the most tranquil slumber, got up full of life and free from the disease, which up to that time had seemed incurable. In the summer of the same year, 1858, the cholera was raging at Tivoli in Italy, and a man, who lived not far from Subiaco, was seized with the most excruciating pains. In a few hours this terrible malady had made such progress that his friend ran in great haste to bring the priest, that he might administer the last sacraments. In the meantime the danger became so great that the sick man thought himself at the point of death, and swooned away from the violence of the pain. A few moments after he returned to himself, and felt that his sufferings were still increasing. The cramps in his stomach were more violent than ever, and endeavoring to allay them by the pressure of his hands, he touched the medal of St. Benedict, which he always wore. This reminded him to have recourse to the Holy Patriarch, from whom he entertained the most lively devotion. His pains immediately disappeared. He gets up, leaves his bed, and seeing the priest, who, out of breath, with the perspiration running down his face, had just come into the house, "Father," he exclaimed, "I am cured!" And showing him the medal, he added, "See what has saved me." The good man paid a visit not long after to the Benedictine Abbey of St. Paul at Rome, taking with the certificates of both the priest and the doctor, which bears testimony to the truth of this extraordinary cure. In February 1861, a colony of Benedictines from the Abbey of St. Paul at Rome established itself near the town of Cleves in Rhenish Prussia. They began to build an enclosure round the little garden of the new monastery. The man who acted as superintendent of repairs of the parish church, which was served by Benedictine fathers, offered to go and purchase them wood they required for the building of the enclosure. Accordingly, he repaired to the place where felling trees in the government forests. This he had been given to him the medal of St. Benedict. He carried it on his person with the greatest devotion. After having loaded his cart with several large trunks of wood, he began to move one of the trees which had not been properly fastened, and it came rolling down. The good man was at the back of the cart, and not being able to get out of the way in time, was knocked down, and his leg was almost crushed to pieces. He was carried home. The prior of the monastery, on seeing the frightful accident, said to the bystanders, since it was in the service of St. Benedict that he got wounded, that St. Benedict would cure him. One of the religious mentioned this to the poor man, who had already been thinking of having recourse to his medal, which he never ceased to wear. Placing it on his leg, which was so fearfully crushed, he fastens it there with a bandage. In a very short time he falls fast asleep, and continued so till late the following morning, when he awakes, gets up without the slightest difficulty, and finds the wounds as perfectly healed as though there had been no accident at all. In 1861, at Chambery, in the convent called St. Benedict's, one of the sisters had been suffering for 3 months most acute pains in her legs, brought on by having been exposed to the draughts and unusual heavy works. She could not make up to her mind to tell her sufferings to anyone, nor had she employed any remedy. At last she resolved on making a novena in the honor of St. Benedict, and during its time to make use of the medal in order to obtain the protection of the Holy Patriarch. During the 9 days she used often to press the medal strongly upon her legs, first on one and then on the other, at the same time invoking the aid of St. Benedict, and each time the pains were relieved. She went on, however, with the heavy work which her duties in the house required her. The first novena not having produced any other effect than mere momentary relief, she decided on a second. This was blessed with a perfect success, and entirely removed the pain. The same sister, being afterwards afflicted with sore eyes, had recourse to the same remedy, and having bathed her eyes with water into which she had dipped the medal, her sight was immediately strengthened, and in a few days became as good as it ever had been. About the same time there lived in Savoy a little girl 6 years old, who had been, for several weeks, suffering the most excruciating pains. The child's nerves had become contracted, and to touch her, even with the tip of the finger, caused her to feel agonies of torture. In such a state as this, she could neither eat nor drink. Her parents had employed all the remedies which medical skill could suggest without success. The case was evidently an incurable one. 2 sisters of the convent of St. Benedict, which we have just mentioned, went to visit the little girl, for she belonged to the school which they managed, and to offer some consolation to the mother, on reaching home, they bethought themselves of the medal of St. Benedict. They immediately sent one with word that it should be put round the child's neck, and that she should be persuaded to swallow something into which the medal should have been previously dipped. The mother of the little sufferer faithfully complied with the pious prescription. An immediate change was visible, and after a few days the child got up perfectly cured. In the same country, but in the preceding year, 2 women were cured, one of the military fever after confinement, and the other of a dangerous attack of dropsy on the chest, and both of them by drinking something into which the medal of St. Benedict had been put. In the district of Westmoreland, Pennsylvania, during the month of August 1861, Mrs. X, a Catholic, perceived that one of her daughters was taken with a violent attack of diphtheria. It began about evening, and kept getting worse every hour. It was the more distressing owing to the difficulty of finding a doctor in that part of the country. The nearest was almost 12 miles off. The mother had great faith in the protection of St. Benedict, and had one of his medals in her possession. She resolved on putting this medal into a tumbler of water, and making her child drink it. She did so. The child drank the water thus sanctified by the contact of the medal, and the next morning was out of all danger. In the early part of the year of 1863, at Montigny-le-Roi, there was a woman who had been suffering for a long time the most severe attacks of earache. Clots of blood and bad matter would occasionally come forth from the ear, showing the diseased state of the organ. At the length deafness came on, and the poor woman was unfit for any work. Having had a medal of St. Benedict given to her, she put it to her ear, and said a pater and ave in honor of the Holy Patriarch. The moment after, she was completely cured, and could hear as well as she ever had done in her life. The same year, at Anna-de-Brézé, Miss R.G. was for 2 years threatened with a cancer on the forehead. A painful gland had formed on it, and had resisted all the remedies which medical men had employed to cure it. One evening, before retiring to rest, this young lady thought of placing on her forehead during the night the medal of St. Benedict, at the same time earnestly recommending herself to the Holy Patriarch's protection. She slept most soundly that night, and the next morning, after taking off the medal, found to her surprise that the gland had entirely disappeared. At Limoges in the year 1864, in the house of the Sisters of St. Joseph, a postulant came to show one of her superiors her arm in which some foreign body had entered. She was suffering most acute pains, and this led to the conjecture that a needle had entered the flesh, and on the feeling the arm it seemed evident that certainly something of that nature must have entered. A surgeon was sent for, in the hope that by lancing the arm the poor creature might be somewhat relieved. All at once, before the doctor arrived even, the idea struck the assistant sister of having recourse to the medal of St. Benedict. She placed it straightway on the wounded arm. After having recited together 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys, with the invocation of St. Benedict, the postulant said, "Suppose I try to draw out the needle?" "Try," answered the assistant's sister. Their efforts were not of the slightest avail, and tended only to increase the pain. The assistant then said to the sister, "Press with the medal on one side." The sister obeyed. Scarcely had she pressed it upon the side of the arm that the needle appeared on the other, and they were able to draw it out easily, and that without causing pain. When the surgeon arrived, his services were not required. At Montauban, in the year 1865, an invalid lady, unable to move, was confined to her bed for 2 years and a half, and everything seemed to forebode that she would remain thus helpless the rest of her life. One day, after the priest had brought her Holy Communion, a sister of charity, who had just come on her accustomed visit, with some difficulty managed to place the medal of St. Benedict between her fingers, and succeeded with great exertion in bringing the hand of the sick lady to rest upon her breast, hoping the touch of this sacred object would produce some good result. Immediately, the invalid felt a thrill throughout her whole being. A copious perspiration broke out, and these words escaped her lips, "I am cured." At once life returned to her limbs. She attempted to rise, and riddling herself of the flannels in which she had been swathed for so long a time, put on once more the clothes which she had been in the habit of wearing before her sickness. As early as the following day, she betook herself to the church to give thanks to God for her sudden cure. Madame A.S., a lady of the Diocese of Le Mans, in the year 1868, suffered intense pains in the head from neuralgia, which was caused by a decayed tooth. All ordinary remedies had been tried, and none had had any effect. The patient had recourse to the medal of St. Benedict, and pressing it close to her cheek, held it there, but it gave her no relief. After the lapse of about a half an hour, all the time holding the medal to her cheek, she received a visit from a neighboring friend, who had just been acquainted with the news of her illness, and the sick woman gave him an account in a disconnected manner of the violence of her sufferings. Her visitor, seized with compassion, suggested that perhaps a little brandy kept in her mouth for a short time would at least deaden the pain a little. As there was no brandy in the house, he sent to his own home a person who was present to get some, charging him to return with it quickly. Scarcely had the messenger closed the door behind him that the pain stopped suddenly, never more to return. St. Benedict, whose medal had been used only after medical aid had proved useless, would not allow material means to succeed, after use had been made of the glorious emblem of his power, and the cure of the poor sufferer was instantaneous. On the spiritual favors obtained by the use of the medal. The greater number of favors obtained during our own times by means of St. Benedict's medal have reference to the instantaneous conversion of sinners, who had been called callous to all that had previously been tried, in order to bring them to God. We will mention a few of these instances. In a provincial town of France there was living a gentleman in very comfortable circumstances, who had once held a government appointment. His sister, an exceedingly pious widowed lady, nursed him with the most affectionate care during his frequent attacks of illness, but was, above all, most anxious to induce her dear brother to think upon doing something for his salvation. Hitherto all her efforts had been fruitless. No matter how gentle or indirect her attempts, they were all met with this cold answer: "Do not talk to me about seeing a priest. I cannot bear to hear the subject mentioned." The sister went, at last, to a friend, and told him in confidence of her trouble, and he said to her, "Pay no attention to your brother's answer. Persevere in your entreaties. If by your silence you suffer him to fall into hell, he would surely not excuse you." In this way, several years elapsed. In the December of 1846, after a short illness, there were evidences of gangrene. The doctors not only pronounced such to be the case, but moreover that an operation would be useless, and finally that the sick man could not live 2 days longer. The friend who had advised the sister not to be deterred by the words of her brother one day came to see her. She was overwhelmed with grief, but declared that not even now had she the courage to put the question to him. "Well then," says the friend, "take these 2 medals of St. Benedict. Keep one for yourself, that the devil may not hinder you from doing your duty, and put the other under your brother's pillow." She took his advice, and 5 minutes had scarcely passed when the following conversation took place between the brother and the sister. "Dear sister," said the sick man. "Well, brother, what is it?" "My dear sister, do you not think it would be right to send for the priest?" The priest was accordingly sent for and soon arrived. The sick man received him with joy, and all the rites of the church were administered. 2 days after he died in the most edifying dispositions. In 1854, in a hospital of incurables, there was a woman advanced in years who was almost entirely paralyzed and quite bedridden. With no more religion about her than that of an impious lunatic, she would utter at times such disgusting language and such horrid blasphemies that many persons looked upon her as one possessed by the devil. There were reasons for suspecting that she kept near her certain articles which prompted her to all this wickedness. It happened that one day, when the ward had to undergo a thorough cleaning, she was obliged to be taken from her bed, and put for the time in a room near at hand. She screamed, or rather howled, with rage, but she was obliged to yield. The nuns of the hospital found under the mattress a bag filled with objects of a most suspicious character. They took it away, and put in its place a medal of St. Benedict. In an hour or so the poor woman was carried back to her bed, without of course being told of what had been done. Scarcely, however, did she come near the bed than she began to abuse the sisters for having taken away her treasure, of which no doubt the devil took great care to tell her. In spite of all this, she was laid on the bed, when suddenly her screaming ceased, and she became as quiet as a lamb. The hideous look she ordinarily put on was changed into one of joy. The poor creature then asked for a priest. A few days after the infirmary was arranged as a chapel, prettily lit up, and flowers placed here and there, to receive our Lord, who was coming to comfort and cure this soul, now set free, like a captive bird from the snares of hell. In 1859, a poor woman was telling her troubles to a person who knew something of the efficacy with which our Lord had enriched the medal of St. Benedict. Her husband, though a clever workman, was a great drunkard. All they earned was regularly spent at the end of the week, and of course there was nothing in the house but wretchedness. The person to whom she spoke gave her one of the medals, advising her to touch it with it to the bottle of wine which she put before her husband at meals, though she herself was obliged to be satisfied with water. When he had tasted the wine, he exclaimed, "What wretched stuff! Give me some water, for it is better than such a wine as this. I will make up for it after." When he had finished his dinner, he made his wife give him some money, and went to his old place, the neighboring public-house, from which he was always accustomed to come back home late at night intoxicated. In about a quarter of an hour he came home, telling his wife that he was sure this was a plot against him, for the wine at the tavern was worse than their own. It was a happy night for both. Next day, and the next few days, water was the only beverage the poor man could bear to touch. When this much was gained, his wife, who was an excellent Christian, had not much difficulty in persuading him to fulfill henceforward his religious duties. In the same year, 1859, there was a woman 80 years old who had declared that she was determined to die without going to confession. It was upwards of 60 years since she had been to the sacraments. The priest, who was asked by a friend to visit her, was prepared for a refusal. A medal was put into the priest's hand, and the person who gave it to him said, "Go, and fear not." On his entering her room, the old lady turned her face towards the wall, saying aloud that she intended going to sleep. "Do so," replied the priest, "but take this medal, I beg of you, and meanwhile I will say a little prayer." He knelt down by the bedside, and before he had time to finish the memorare, the old lady turned towards him, told her relatives to leave the room, and began her confession. On the 14th of March, 1859, a pious layman happened to meet in the streets a priest who was much distressed about a young man of 17 who had come home from Paris so ill that the doctors was of the opinion that he could not live many days. The priest had been 3 times to the house, but the family would not receive him. The layman, on hearing this, spoke to him about the wonderful efficacy of St. Benedict's medal, gave him one, and encouraged him to make another trial. The priest went, and at first met with the same reception. He then brought forth the medal, which he said he wished to give to the young man. "Oh, if that is all," said the person who was speaking to him, "you may come in." Finally, he got into the room of the young man, who no sooner saw him than he hid his face in his bedclothes. "My dear friend," said the priest, "accept this little present from me." Immediately he uncovered his face, and he began his confession with the most admirable sentiments of contrition. In 1860, an old man was received into one of the Paris hospitals, and falling seriously ill there, it was evident that he had but a very short time to live. He was a Protestant. The sisters, who had the care of the hospital, seeing that there was no chance of his recovery, lost no time in making every possible effort to secure to him the life of the soul. For this end they had made a novena after novena, private and general communions had been offered up, and they had got a great many masses said. It seemed, however, to be of no avail. It happened one Sunday that a friend, having come to the hospital to visit the sick, and being informed of the poor Protestant who was so near death, advised them to give the sick man a medal of St. Benedict, and in case he would refuse it, to put it under his pillow. The advice was instantly followed, and the medal was put round the neck of the dying man. The next time the same person came to the hospital, he had the consolation of hearing that the very Sunday he had advised them to use the medal, The Protestant had asked at 12 o'clock at night to be received into the church. They offered to send for either of the two nearest parish priests, but he refused, saying that he would prefer the chaplain of the house, whom he happened to know. This latter, not having the faculties necessary for receiving the sick man's abjuration or for absolving him from heresy, leave was obliged to be sent for to the archbishop, so that in spite of all the diligence that was used, it was not possible to administer the sacraments to the sick man before 9 o'clock the next morning. The old man received all the rites of the church with great devotion, and died tranquilly in the evening of the same day. In the town of Noyon in France there was a pious workwoman who was in great trouble on account of her mother being out of her mind, and having fits from time to time, during which she was perfectly furious. People who brought work to the daughter were afraid of the poor mad mother, who would sometimes seize anything she could get a hold of in the room and throw it out of the window. There was every reason for fearing that some day or other she would destroy herself. This state of things went on for several years, but there was nothing which so afflicted the daughter as the impossibility of her mother ever getting to confession, which was the more distressing as this state of madness had seized the poor creature so suddenly that she had not an opportunity of settling the affairs of her conscience. In the year 1861, a pious Christian happened to give her a medal of St. Benedict, which she contrived to put round her mother's neck. The same instant all her madness ceased. She took the medal and kissed it unceasingly. Soon after, she made her confession in the most edifying manner. Since then, she has continued to be as gentle and quiet as a lamb, and though the infirmities of old age now oblige her to keep her bed, she never gives way to anything like impatience, and there seems to be every likelihood of her dying a happy death. Protection against the snares of the devil. Protection is one of the special influences which the medal of the Patriarch St. Benedict possesses, and which may be the principal object for which God have given this sacramental to the faithful. The power it possesses to frustrate evil's stratagems. We here mention a few facts that will do more than merely interest our readers. They will suggest to them what they themselves may do, so if they ever find themselves in circumstances which today are anything but impossible. In 1839, a celebrated magnetizer who had performed incredibly wonderful things in different towns in France, where he advertised that he was going to give public performances. He took about all these different places a young girl on whom he exercised his mesmerism, and he drew crowded audiences by the extraordinary effects he produced on his poor victim. In the town of which we are now speaking, he attracted an immense crowd by his advertisement. The lecture was to be given in a very large building which anciently had been a church, but had been turned to profane use long before this. The hour came, but nothing that the magnetizer did had the slightest effect, and the girl remained unmoved by all his passes. The audience was dismissed, and the money returned to those who grumbled at being disappointed. A few hours after, placards were plastered up all over the town, announcing a second meeting at such an hour in the town hall. But this time also the lecturer could do nothing, and after all this trouble and expense, he stole away from the town. Next day came the papers with their scientific explanations of the failure. One would have it that the room had been too hot, another that the gas was too much turned on, and the rest, of course, none of them assigned the true cause. A nun, who happened to hear of the proposed lecture, and knowing that the church is opposed to the practice of mesmerism, resolved on thwarting the operation of the lecturer, so far as they had any connection with the devil. All she did was to hang out of her cell window a medal of St. Benedict, and beg the intervention of the Holy Patriarch. The result was what we have related, and the prince of the power of this air, as the apostle calls Satan, was vanquished. In the year of 1840, a town council proposed to widen one of its streets, though it was already quite wide enough for the traffic. The measure was carried, and it was resolved that they should pull down a large portion of a church dedicated to Our Blessed Lady, and much frequented by pilgrims. In order to carry out this plan, they began to build a partition wall to the whole length of the church. Our Lady's altar was within the part to be taken down, and therefore was to be destroyed by this whim of the street commissioners. The wall had risen 20 feet, and one can imagine the mess and confusion in the church caused by the masons. A gentleman, who was passing through the town, was grieved to see such a sad profanation, and going up to the statue of Our Lady, which had been brought from its own place into the portion of the church which was to be spared, he put a medal of St. Benedict on the pedestal. A few days after, the town surveyor, who had been mainly instrumental in this measure, died suddenly. His successor, when coming to inspect the works, soon perceived how totally unnecessary such a change was, even were it not a desecration, and stopped the works. The next day he went before the town council and submitted to its consideration so satisfactory a report upon the matter that the first decision was revoked. The wall, which had been almost reached as high as the ceiling, was taken down, and the people saw their dear old church given back to them. In one of our French towns, a certain gentleman of high position, placed over some most important works, had in his employ a man whom the enemy of all good made use of as a tool to lessen the influence of his master. All hopes of his amendment had been abandoned, and the evil increased day by day, when someone in the establishment put a medal of St. Benedict over the framework of the room door of this man who had proved so mischievous in his position of trust. From that time forward to remain in the room became next to impossible for him. On the 20th of March 18th, at 12 o'clock, the hour at which the first vespers of St. Benedict were ending, on account of it being Lent, he threw up his employment, and on the following day, which was the feast of St. Benedict, he quitted the establishment. Not far from the city of Rennes, there was a café and billiard room kept by a good Catholic family. For some years they had noticed strange symptoms of the place being infested with demons. When there was no one at the billiard table, noises and voices were sometimes heard, as though there was a very large party playing. Pieces of furniture were changed from place to place in the house without any one of the family touching them. Doors opened and shut apparently themselves, and a strange noise was heard in the bedrooms. One Christmas night, the servant had gone up to the attic to get herself ready for midnight mass, when she found all that part of the house filled with a thick smoke, in the midst of which there was something which she could not lay hold of, moving to and fro. She screamed, hurried out of the place, and fainted. But these strange appearances were frequently happening, and of course kept the inmates of the house in a state of continual alarm. They had got many masses said for the dead, and had had the house blessed with the formula prescribed by the Church for these occasions, but up to that time all had proved ineffectual. Nothing, therefore, remained for the inmates of the house but to abandon it, though it was quite new, and they had hoped to find in it a convenient and comfortable home. A pious woman spoke to them about St. Benedict's medal, and persuaded them to make use of it. They began by putting it over every door in the house, and immediately all was quiet. But they had not thought of placing the sign of salvation in the doorway leading to the cellar, and all the fury of the evil spirits seemed to concentrate there, so great was the noise and disorder which began to be heard from that quarter. The medal was put there also, and the influence of Satan seemed to at least have entirely quitted the house, not, however, without seeking his revenge by there and then taking possession of the person who related all this to the writer. Cruel indeed were the sufferings which the devil caused his victim to endure both in body and soul. This person, however, obtained, after some time, deliverance from this terrible trial by following the counsels of an enlightened director, who recommended the poor sufferer not to be afraid of the devil, and to pronounce frequently the holy names of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. In the year 1863, a community of nuns who kept a boarding school noticed that the first glass lamps in the study place and those in the refectory of the boarding school were by turns broken. The drinking glasses of the lay sisters in like manner were found broken in the refectory drawers. No system of supervision was able to bring to light the cause of the mischief, which was of daily occurrence. This state of affairs lasted for several weeks, when the idea came to the mind of one of the sisters of having recourse to the medal of St. Benedict. The nuns put this medal in the lamp and in their drawers, and forthwith the accident ceased. But what was more astonishing still was that the lamps which lighted the galleries and the other rooms of the house were now attacked in their turn, and the breakages began again worse than ever. They only ceased after the sisters had taken the resolution of employing the same means which had been so successful in the study room and refectory of the establishment. Then at last they were freed from all further annoyances. Preservation in danger. During the month of April 1864, a gentleman of the city of Tours narrated to us the following event. He was a visitor at the watering place of Bourbon-Sancy during the summer months of one of the preceding years, when a thunderbolt happened to strike one of the houses there and reduced it to ashes. One room only, occupied by 2 girls, escaped destruction. No one could explain so unaccountable an escape, so that all the town flocked to gaze at this marvel. The gentleman also betook himself to the spot where the company was. After having closely examined the arrangement of the various portions of the building and listened to the story of the inhabitants, he had no hesitation in believing that there had taken place some supernatural intervention. He even felt within himself that St. Benedict had not been a stranger to the event, and taking from his pocket a medal of the Holy Patriarch, he offered it to these good young girls. But hardly had they caught sight of this little present he was offering them, when they exclaimed, "But we already have that medal. Yesterday our brother, having been to water some horses, met a person who had some of those medals, and knowing that it would give us great pleasure, he asked for one, which he brought home to us some minutes before the storm." May the intercession of the blessed Patriarch and Abbot Benedict render thee, O Lord, merciful unto us, that what our own unworthiness cannot obtain, we may receive through his powerful patronage, through Christ our Lord. Amen.